Excellencies, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, dear students, dear friends, I'm delighted to welcome you to the first day of Reconnect's final conference, which has the title, The Future of Europe, How to Strengthen the EU's Fundamental Values. Our conference will, in fact, be a bit like an Indian wedding, lasting 3 days, with each day focusing on one of the topics at the heart of Reconnect. Today, the 19th of April, we are online for a conference called Stronger Rule of Law for a Stronger EU. Tomorrow, 20th of April, we are again online in the afternoon for a conference on democratic renewal for a more resilient EU. And on Thursday, 21st of April, we will have an in-person conference. Yes, in person, with good food. Conference at the Fondation Universitaire in the heart of Brussels. It will also be hybrid, so you can also attend online, under the title, The Future of the European Union, Reconciling Europe and its Citizens Through Democracy and Rule of Law. So this afternoon will be dedicated to the topic, A Stronger Rule of Law for a Stronger EU. And before we get into the program of today, I would like to briefly introduce Reconnect to those of you who are new to the project, as well as zoom in on the reason why we still need to discuss the rule of law crisis, which has been, but also is still plaguing the European Union. Reconnect is an acronym that stands for Reconciling Europe with its Citizens Through Democracy and Rule of Law. It's a 4-year multidisciplinary Horizon 2020 project, which was launched on the 1st of May, 2018, and which comes to an end at the end of this month of April, bringing together 18 partner institutions from 14 different countries. I have the honor, the pleasure, but also the burden of being the overall coordinator of this beautiful project. And what is the goal of Reconnect? We aim to understand and provide solutions to challenges faced by the European Union with an explicit focus on strengthening the EU's legitimacy through democracy and the rule of law. And while we will discuss democracy and the rule of law on separate moments in our conference, I should already stress that Reconnect believes that democracy and rule of law, as well as the other fundamental values of the European Union, are inseparable, intertwined, and interdependent, which implies that the quality of one cannot be properly evaluated without considering the quality of the other. And likewise, during our conference, it is also important to keep in mind that both the rule of law and democracy can no longer act as legitimizing forces if they are not conducive to the other fundamental values of the Union, in particular, solidarity, justice, and human rights. Now, over the past 4 years, Reconnect has taken a multidisciplinary and multifaceted approach to these issues. We have been analyzing the concepts of democracy and rule of law in the EU, in its member states, through 3 dimensions, and also 3 distinct units of analysis: principles, practices, perceptions. And this approach, which is both theoretical and very empirical, has yielded many insights on the rule of law and how it can be strengthened in Europe. Well, first of all, Reconnect research has brought conceptual clarity. We have debunked, and I hope once and for all, the allegation that the rule of law is a vague or arbitrary concept. Reconnect has addressed key questions surrounding the meaning and the scope of the rule of law in the context of the European Union, and we have come to the conclusion that the rule of law should be considered, and I quote from one of our reports, a core and consensual element of Europe's legal space, end of quote. From this, it actually follows that the most pressing issues concerning the rule of law today are practical and not conceptual in nature. And that is why our Reconnect consortium, as you will hear in a few moments, has carefully examined and identified what can be considered the best practices of the rule of law. Finally, Reconnect has also examined in detail the question of the rule of law toolbox of the Union. And we have reached the primary conclusion that there is no need to reinvent the wheel, and that existing instruments are broadly adequate to uphold the rule of law in the EU and its member states, provided they are adequately used. Yet, there is still a lot of room for improvement if the European Union intends to strengthen the rule of law. And it is in light of this idea that as a consortium, Reconnect has focused the past year of research on policy and treaty change recommendations, as well as on imagining a new narrative for the future of European integration. While at this point, changing the treaties may not seem very likely, it is important, we think, to put workable and evidence-based proposals on the table for discussion among stakeholders, governments, the public at large. And that is what we have done and what we are also partially presenting to you today. Our Reconnect colleagues in today's program will further discuss the recommendations which concern the rule of law in full detail with all of you. And our recommendations on democracy will be highlighted tomorrow at the second conference day. To keep a little bit of suspense, the full version of the new narrative for European integration, as well as the full overview of the Reconnect policy and treaty change recommendations, will be featured on the third and last conference day on Thursday. So please do stay tuned with all of us for this full 3-day program if you want to learn all about our insights and proposals. Now let me very briefly now expand a little bit on this afternoon's topic, because you can raise the question, why should we still devote yet again a conference to discuss the rule of law in Europe? Well, slowly but steadily, the rule of law has come under significant pressure in Europe through a series of crises. And you know the list: the financial and the Eurozone sovereign debt crisis, the refugee crisis, COVID-19, and most recently, the security crisis that has followed Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And although the rule of law crisis has been going on for at least 10 years, there is still no end in sight. For instance, in the recent Hungarian elections, the political party of Viktor Orban reached a 2/3 majority amid the myriad of rule of law concerns that have long been present in Hungary. And the devastating Ukraine war also brings about new rule of law related questions for the European Union. For instance, if the EU planned to launch the recent rule of law conditionality mechanism to uphold the rule of law in certain member states, can it still do so? Should it still do so at a time when those member states are harboring many Ukrainian refugees and are undergoing the additional economic fallout of Russia's military aggression? At a time of profound change, upheaval, and uncertainty, we seek all stability, accessibility, and wisdom from our common institutions. And that is exactly what Reconnect aims to help the EU achieve through the research and recommendations that we present to you today. Allow me to very shortly guide you through our exciting program of this afternoon, which will kick off with a keynote by Elizabeth Anderson, the director of the World Justice Project. Her keynote will be followed by a presentation by two of our very distinguished consortium colleagues on Reconnect's findings, policy recommendations, and proposed treaty changes related to the rule of law. That's Professor Petra Barth and Professor Laurent Pech. Thereafter, we will have the immense pleasure and honor of sharing with you a personal testimony by Professor Ann Rosas former judge at the European Court of Justice, and currently the president of the very important Article 255 committee. After that, we will have a panel discussion with many learned colleagues on the next steps to be taken in the unrelenting rule of law crisis. And we close today's program with a keynote by the President of the Court of Justice of the European Union himself, Professor Koen Leenaerts. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, students, friends, I hope you are all looking forward to this conference as much as I am. And I wish you all a very engaging afternoon. Thank you very much. And I now hand over to Professor Petra Barth to introduce our keynote speaker, Elisabeth Anderson. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Wouters, for the kind introduction to our conference. And let me also express a warm welcome to our audience across the world on behalf of the Reconnect Rule of Law teams. My name is Petra Barth, representing the Central European University in the Reconnect project, and together with Professor Laurent Pesch from Middlesex University, we will co-chair this afternoon. And it is my absolute pleasure and privilege to introduce you to our keynote speaker today, Elisabeth Anderson, who is Executive Director of the World Justice Project, advancing the rule of law through research, advocacy, and support for a global stakeholder network. She was previously Director of the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative and Executive Director of the American Society of International Law. As a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the American Law Institute, she serves on the governing and advisory boards of several nonprofit organizations and has received a number of awards for her work in the international rule of law field. She has a BA from Williams College, an MPA from Princeton, and a JD from Yale. Please, Mrs. Anderson, the floor is yours.
Professor Bard, Professor Wouters, thank you so much for that introduction, and even more for the valuable work that the Reconnect project over the past 4 years has contributed to our understanding of the rule of law. Your work has been rigorous and illuminating and greatly strengthened understanding of the European project, its strengths and weaknesses, and where it needs to go from here. I anticipate that the impact of this project will continue to reverberate for years to come, and it is a true honor to participate in this culminating conference. In my brief remarks, I would like to reflect on the state of the rule of law in Europe and to put it and the Reconnect recommendations to strengthen it in global perspective. While the Reconnect project has quite appropriately focused on Europe, the issues with which you are grappling are part of a global phenomenon. And I will argue, what you do about them has very significant implications for the rule of law around the world, as well as in Europe. Let me begin with a quick overview of rule of law trends in Europe, drawing on the World Justice Project's Rule of Law Index, which annually measures the rule of law in 139 countries and jurisdictions across 8 different dimensions of the rule of law. They are constraints on government powers, absence of corruption, open government, fundamental rights, order and security, regulatory enforcement, civil justice, and criminal justice. The WJP Index measures the rule of law based on surveys about the experiences and perceptions of the general public and in-country legal practitioners and experts in each of these areas. We have presented and discussed this data with the Reconnect community on several occasions over the past year, so I won't go into it in depth. Those who are interested in learning more about it can probe the data on the World Justice Project website. But I will share some high-level findings from the index, and these mirror those of other measures of the rule of law and good governance. The finding overall is that Europe has relatively strong rule of law in its member states. There is a good reason that the rule of law is a core EU value. It is deeply embedded in the political and legal culture of this region. Overall, Europe is the region that scores consistently highest in the WJP index, with EU member states holding 8 of the top 10 slots in our 2021 index, and all but 6 member states ranked in the top 35 out of 139 countries in that study. This superior rule of law performance has been consistent over many years, with a number of EU member states continuing to improve their index scores year over year, even during the pandemic, when the vast majority of jurisdictions globally saw rule of law erode. So what is all the fuss about? As Professor Wouters asked at the outcome, at the outset of our discussion, why are we so preoccupied with the current rule of law situation in Europe? Well, as this community well knows, you have spent 4 years studying it, this is not the whole story about the rule of law in Europe. Indeed, there are 3 reasons why the rule of law in Europe bears heightened attention, notwithstanding the overall comparatively rosy picture. First, the positive performance in most EU member states masks notable variance across different dimensions of the rule of law and also among and within countries, with significant negative trends in some jurisdictions. Second, despite the generally strong rule of law in most member states, as the Reconnect work has highlighted, there are deficiencies in the rule of law at European Union level, and these weaknesses undermine the legitimacy of EU actions, including steps to uphold rule of law within member states and around the world. Third, the rule of law challenges facing Europe are not isolated. As I mentioned, these are part of a global phenomenon that has seen rule of law norms contested in every region of the world. Because of its relatively strong rule of law and the governance tools at its disposal, the EU is uniquely placed to lead the world out of this global rule of law recession. Let me elaborate each of these 3 points. First, I turn to the variance in rule of law among EU member states. Rule of law across Europe has in recent years seen great highs and lows. While certain EU member states consistently score at the top of global indices, others have seen persistent, steep declines. These data are well known to this audience, but what I want to underscore today is how unusual this is. What we at WJP know from our work tracking rule of law developments over more than a decade is that rule of law usually changes very slowly, and it's generally not changing in a linear fashion. In the vast majority of countries, we see scores change only incrementally year over year. And they usually go up and down, with progress just inching forward or backward over time. Indeed, of the 102 countries we have measured since 2015, only 4 have consistently declined in their index score year over year. What's important to note here today is that 3 of these experiencing persistently declining rule of law are in the EU or among candidate countries, namely Poland, Hungary, and Bosnia and Herzegovina. Moreover, the fall off in rule of law has been particularly sharp in these countries, with Poland and Hungary each seeing a 10% decline in their overall score since 2015. There aren't many countries that have fallen greater amounts than that. Only Belarus, Cambodia, Cameroon, Egypt, Nicaragua, the Philippines, and Venezuela saw as precipitous a deterioration in their index score since 2015. Over this same period, only 7 of the 102 countries saw consistent improvements in their rule of law score year over year. And here again, Europe is a standout, with 3 of the 7 being EU member states, namely Germany, Italy, and Spain. And if for these purposes we count Norway in Europe, there are 4 that have seen consistent improvement over this period. These data underscore the rule of law challenge with which the EU is grappling. On the one hand, overall, we see strong rule of law within most member states, reflecting the powerful norms they share and that are at the heart of the European project. On the other, there is a relatively rapid divergence emerging between member states, with some at the top further strengthening their rule of law and others persistently marching in a very different direction, literally ripping at a fabric of Europe in the process. Moreover, looking more closely at the data, the challenge is not just in the few states that have seen these sharp declines. Even in EU member states with strong rule of law, the data suggest there's room for improvement in certain regions and on particular dimensions of the rule of law. As captured in the European Quality of Government Index published by the University of Gothenburg, people in less well-developed regions generally report lower perceptions and experience relating to corruption and with respect to the impartiality and quality of government services. In a similar vein, studies show those in rural areas generally express less trust in government, particularly at the national and EU level. As an aside, I should note here that WJP is currently developing a new initiative to generate more indicators and data on the different manifestations of rule of law at the subnational level throughout the EU. We want to better understand these regional differences, and we look forward to sharing that data with the Reconnect community in the future. So we see important variance, not just among EU member states, but also within them. Performance also varies among the different dimensions of rule of law in EU member states. Most get high marks for order and security in the WJP Rule of Law Index. But in many countries, we see wide variance between those scores on order and security at the top and how countries are performing on other factors in our index. Of particular note, many countries get relatively weaker marks for the functioning of their criminal and civil justice systems, including access to justice. Legal needs surveys that we and others have carried out in recent years illuminate the challenge behind this data. In 2017 and 2018, WJP undertook an in-depth study of people's everyday civil legal needs in 101 countries, including 20 EU member states. We found that in most of the EU states studied, well more than 50% of people surveyed said they had experienced a legal problem in the past 2 years. Problems relating to money and debt, consumer issues, housing, family disputes, and access to social services being among the most prevalent. Although these problems are widely experienced, on average, only 1/3 reported they had been able to access assistance from an advisor or institution to resolve their problem. Many reported simply giving up solving their problems. And moreover, on average, more than 40% reported experiencing hardship, including illness, relationship breakdown, and loss of employment or housing as a result of those unmet legal needs. For these populations, for whom justice systems are failing, perhaps lofty declarations about the rule of law ring hollow or seem out of touch, maybe even hypocritical. In some, notwithstanding the generally high rule of law performance in EU member states, there remains work to do. Arresting the sharp decline in the rule of law in a few member states is an urgent priority. And I look forward to the discussion of recommendations on that score today. But I would also urge attention to gaps in certain dimensions of the rule of law that persist in many member states. In particular, I would hope that as part of the agenda to strengthen the rule of law, EU member states will seize the opportunity to shift resources toward people-centered justice that is locally led, data-driven, and inclusive. Realizing justice in people's everyday lives can provide a tangible, demonstrable benefit of the rule of law that shores up trust in institutions and builds important constituencies for rule of law values. So persistent and in some cases growing deficiencies in member states' performance is the first reason I urge attention to the rule of law in Europe. The second is the gap in certain aspects of the rule of law at EU level. WJP does not gather data on the performance of EU institutions, but other indicators suggest, as the Reconnect final report highlights, that there are certain gaps between rule of law ideals and people's perceptions and experience of those ideals in practice at EU level. These gaps can undermine trust and threaten the European project. In particular, gaps in accountability of EU decision-making, both interinstitutionally and broadly accountability to citizens, remain an issue. The Reconnect report underscores the concentration of authority on certain matters in the Council, with decision-making disproportionately weighting individual member states' prerogatives over majority perspectives. Coupled with the relative opacity of EU processes and the limited role for the European Parliament, it is no wonder that, according to the Eurobarometer, less than half of all respondents, 44%, feel that their voice counts in the EU. These feelings and trust in the European Union are substantially lower for rural residents in almost all EU member states. Indeed, as underscored in the European Commission's recently released triennial cohesion report, quote, compared with city dwellers, rural residents are less likely to trust the EU, say that their voice counts in the EU, and feel attached to the EU. This is a political fissure that can exacerbate polarization and fuel a populist backlash against the EU and its values. These data have been confirmed through the Conference on the Future of Europe process and the clear demand emerging there for greater openness, participation, and accountability to citizens in EU decision-making. As the Reconnect report suggests, herein lies the greatest opportunity for strengthening the EU, evolving it to fully realize its values of democracy, rights, and rule of law. I enthusiastically endorse the Reconnect project's conclusion that, quote, the promise of a democratic union grounded in the rule of law needs a systematic engagement of citizens, the stimulation of a European public sphere, and the development of a plurality of channels for civic input, unquote. I'm excited by the prospect of the EU pursuing governance innovation of this sort and continuing to set global standards as it does so. And this brings me to the third reason that the EU cannot rest on its relative rule of law prowess, and that strengthening the rule of law must continue to be a priority, both internally within the Union and externally. In the face of a multi-year global rule of law recession, the world needs EU leadership more than ever. The pattern is clear. Between 2020 and 2021, WJP found 74% of countries included in the index declined in the rule of law. In every region of the world and in rich and poor countries alike, more countries saw their scores decline than improve. And this is not just a pandemic effect. For each of the past 4 years, a majority of countries saw rule of law deteriorate, with particularly marked declines in the WJP index measures of constraints on government powers and fundamental rights, marking a turn to authoritarian rule by law instead of rule of law in many countries. Against this backdrop, many of us look to Europe. Notwithstanding the very real challenges you face, we look to you as our best hope for a rule of law future. Europe has strong rule of law values born of the trauma of World War II. And today, Europe finds itself once more on the rule of law front lines, seeing up close in Ukraine the devastation wreaked by an unaccountable Russian autocrat. This experience must surely motivate Europeans to do the hard, never-ending work of continuing to strengthen your rule of law and to model new approaches to open, accountable, just government from which the rest of the world can learn. Within a number of member states, there already exist models that are producing good results. These should be studied and adapted to other member states and to the EU level, as the Reconnect project has so ably done. And that learning should be shared further around the world. The Reconnect report speaks of, quote, defending the rule of law. Let me offer a friendly amendment and suggest that the task is not just to draw a line in the sand and defend the rule of law where it is under attack. Sustaining the rule of law requires a proactive agenda to continuously strengthen and promote accountable government that delivers justice everywhere and for everyone. The exemplary power of the European commitment to the rule of law is considerable. So too is the impact of its legislative capacity in a globalized economy. We have seen this in EU standard setting on privacy, for example, and we now anticipate this leadership on regulation of AI and other emerging technologies, as well as on corporate conduct relating to environmental, social, and governance matters. What happens in Brussels and in EU member states has profound implications around the world. And in today's world, the stakes are high. I speak to you from the United States, which last year saw the sharpest decline in its WJP Rule of Law Index score of any country in the EU, EFTA, or North America region. It was also the sharpest decline of any other high-income country. The world, including many of us in the United States, are eager for your governance, innovation, and leadership. Let me conclude then with thanks to the many who have contributed to the Reconnect project over the past 4 years. You have given us much to learn from and build on. This work is just beginning, and indeed, the very nature of the Rule of Law project means that it will never end. But your efforts provide an important foundation that is at once inspiring and practical. It promises to safeguard and strengthen European values, and in the process provide important hope that we can turn the rule of law tide the world over. Thank you for the opportunity to share these reflections, and I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you so much for your fascinating and comprehensive talk. I think we learned a lot and we took note of your advice. Thank you for that as well. I encourage our audience to ask questions in the Q&A window. And while you are typing them in, let me take the opportunity and ask one question to Director Anderson. So one important point that you made was how crucial it was thinking about the rule of law, and not only defensively, for example, curbing the backsliding in the countries with the worst performance, but also proactively, particularly with respect to improving access to justice in all member states. I was wondering whether you wish to elaborate on these findings and on these ideas.
Sure, I'd be happy to. You know, I think the issue of access to justice as a component of the rule of law really underscores the point that Professor Wouters made at the outset, which is the interrelationship between the rule of law and democracy and rights. We really can't have one without the other. And we see that very clearly when we look at access to justice and how people experience justice systems in their everyday lives, and the way in which the performance of justice systems makes them stakeholders, supportive or not in democratic systems of governance. What the point about access to justice also underscores is the multidimensional aspect of the rule of law. And WJP has sought to illuminate this with our index and the 8 different factors which enable us both to have an overall take on the rule of law in any jurisdiction, but then also more finely look at different dimensions of the rule of law. And what we see is in most countries, not a consistent performance across all 8 factors. In our report, there are these wonderful little spider graphs that are something like a Rorschach test that show the strengths and weaknesses in different factors and sub-factors of the rule of law. And when we look at that data in EU member states, one of the things that jumps out is, notwithstanding the overall strength of the rule of law, that performance of justice systems is pretty consistently at the bottom of all of the different factors in our index. And so I think that invites scrutiny of what's going on there and why our systems not performing as effectively as we'd like to see. And legal needs surveys have proven a very important and promising mechanism for evaluating that and really reorienting how we think about justice systems. Historically, we have evaluated justice systems looking at institutional data, the data that comes from courts, the number of cases, the number of judges, the number of courthouses, the budgets, and so on. And what legal needs surveys have shown us is that when we ask people about their legal problems, the vast majority are actually not turning to those institutions. And so when we only look at institutional data, we miss the real story of what's going on and how people are realizing justice or not. And I think that this is an important area of inquiry and policy action in order to address perhaps a real Achilles heel that can undermine trust in institutions and the rule of law in EU member states.
Thank you so much. Now, I was wondering whether you could introduce us into some of the methodological difficulties that you are encountering. I happen to be an expert, maybe I can disclose that, filling your questionnaire. And whenever you have questions like in what percentage of cases is there political influence, for example, in my country, this is a very small percentage, but these are the important cases. So how do you deal with these methodological difficulties? And there is one other methodological issue I would really be interested in how you solve that, because that comes up again and again in the European Union. So how do you develop the standards and the benchmarks? Are they primarily applicable to functioning constitutional democracies? And if so, how will they be applicable, or how do you assess countries that cannot be considered as constitutional democracies anymore? We have this issue, for example, with the Commission's annual rule of law report, which checks whether judgments are digitalized. And it certainly is a plus if they are. However, if the judgments are brought by a non-independent court in denial of fair trial rights, then the fact that they are digitalized it doesn't really make good the problem of lack of independence and denial of fair trial. Similarly, there is one issue concerning the media authorities of the member states, how they are financed. And this, again, is of course a crucial issue. However, in countries where there is media capture and the media authority serves governmental purposes, governmental propaganda, and silencing of government critical voices, the financing of the institution is not necessarily a virtue and certainly does not lead back the country to the path of the rule of law. Do you encounter some similar issues when you aggregate the data?
Great questions. Well, first of all, let me thank you for being one of the experts that fills out the WJP survey. I see I have 170 people online here, so I'm going to make a pitch to invite those of you who are not currently respondents to our survey to be in touch with us at WJP. One of the answers to your question, Professor Bart, is that we rely on having large data sets and respondents from experts in each of the countries that enable us to develop robust measures of these different matters. So a couple of things that I want to underscore in terms of our methodology and how we deal with the issues that you're mentioning. One is, you're absolutely right that, that some of the institutional measures of justice system performance can be misleading. And, you know, particularly as you mentioned, you look at budgets, for example. If you can't do the qualitative analysis beneath that, then you're at a disadvantage and may get a very, very inaccurate picture of things. So the primary way that WJP has grappled with this is by developing indicators that are focused on outcomes as opposed to inputs to systems or outputs of systems. And we gather data on outcomes through surveys, asking people about their experience and perception of different aspects of the rule of law. So for example, on media, our surveys will ask, in practice, the media in your country can freely expose cases of corruption by high-ranking government officers without fear of retaliation. And we ask them to indicate to what extent they agree with that statement. Or, for example, with respect to independence of the judiciary, we might ask a practitioner, based on your experience during the past year with cases between private parties decided by trial courts, what percentage of cases, in what percentage of cases did the final decision reflect the judge's honest evaluation of the available evidence and applicable law? And that gives us a better sense of the outcomes and the way the systems are actually functioning, those kinds of survey questions, than some of the input or output data that you mentioned. Now that, of course, also raises the issue that you mentioned, that what if the percentage of cases is small, where there is improper influence, but they're really important cases. And here, the solution is really, again, to have a multi-dimensional approach to measuring these issues, and many, many questions that come at the issue in different ways. So we ask, as you well know, because you filled out the survey, over 500 questions in each jurisdiction of different cohorts, practitioners in different areas of expertise, and households, individual citizens in each jurisdiction. And that gives us a body of data that enables us to draw conclusions that we think are quite robust and helpful, certainly comparable across jurisdictions. They are also, and this goes to your last question, designed in a way that is not dependent on the form of government. So we were pretty careful in designing the WJP index at the outset to be agnostic as to form of government. And again, the focus on outcomes enables us to do that. It's not to say that it is one measure and there are others, and the kind of qualitative studies that you all have undertaken are really a very important complement and give context and texture to what this data shows. So we welcome that conversation and the collaboration.
Thank you very much. And let me just bundle a couple of cases from the audience, because there are plenty, before giving the floor to Professor Pesch, and then closing with a final question from Professor Scheppely. Some of the questions are pointing to opposite directions. Here are some questions about states which are governed by rule by law instead of rule of law. Is this phenomenon spreading? Is one of the questions. The other question is pointing to the opposite direction. would you say that the approaches are different in attacking the rule of law in different forms of society, since democratic states are also struggling with certain rule of law issues? So how are they different in nature from authoritarian or hybrid regimes? And also, let me ask a final question from Natasha Kazachkin. With regard to the respect by the EU of the rule of law, you mentioned the lack of trust, opacity, lack of voice of citizens. Are there not also direct challenges for failure to act of the EU institution or deals like EU-Turkey that deal with a contested legal basis? And if we are talking about the European Union, some members of the audience were also wondering what would be your 3 recommendations for the EU to take in order to tackle the phenomena.
Great, super questions. So the first question about the phenomenon of rule by law expanding, I think unfortunately the conclusion is yes, we do see that proliferating around the world. It's reflected in other assessments that identify as a rise of authoritarianism. Is really rule by law by a different name, and the trend is clear in our data, particularly with respect to constraints on government powers, our factor 1 in the index, which shows that that authoritarian leadership is the checks on it are eroding in many jurisdictions and in every region of the world. So it's definitely an area of concern. The second question is, are there different approaches in attacking the rule of law? And I think yes and no is the answer there. I think certainly, the rule of law, one of the things that makes it both interesting and challenging to study is that it is, there's no one size fits all approach to the rule of law, and no set of, standard set of institutional arrangements that guarantee the rule of law. So in both the fact that it improves and strengthens in different ways, in different settings and jurisdictions, it also deteriorates in different ways in each context. And so the analysis ultimately has to be quite contextualized. That being said, we do see some consistent trends across jurisdictions where there is this erosion of the rule of law and rising authoritarianism. And it starts with, attacks on independent judiciaries, attacks on media, and consolidation of democratic institutions and co-opting of democratic institutions. One of the things that is perhaps most pernicious and concerning that we see is essentially a co-opting of the rule of law language. So in many jurisdictions, we see authoritarians justifying their actions as rule of law. We know very much that what they are doing is rule by law, not rule of law, but that's confusing and complicated and difficult to communicate to broad publics. And it's a real challenge to all of us in this community to really reclaim the rule of law language and advance a definition and approach to rule of law that comports with the values that I think assemble us all today. For the 3 top recommendations to the European Union, I'm going to defer to all of you because you spent 4 years studying this in depth and have developed a magnificent report that I think reflects the basic ideas that I would put forward. And that is approaches that ensure accountability of institutions, checks and balances, democratic participation, transparency, and open government. Those are the principles that are critical to inform this effort going forward. And I commend you all for developing recommendations in that spirit.
Thank you so much. And I was just informed that most of the questions became moot because you already answered them. So let me close this part of the workshop with a forward-looking question by Professor Shapley, who asks you about the cases where at the global scale where there has been a decline, but then the country managed to turn around and restore the rule of law. So are there any success stories that can teach us lessons about how to fix rule of law problems?
Well, we can look to certain jurisdictions, even among EU member states, that have been consistently improving the rule of law. And here I highlight Italy and Spain, which had challenges relating to the rule of law, continue to, but as I mentioned earlier, stand out as jurisdictions that have been consistently improving across a number of measures in our index in recent years. I always find it perhaps most impressive when countries that have relatively strong rule of law manage to continue to improve. So those are some examples to look at and to study. In other more embattled environments, Uzbekistan is a kind of surprising case in our index. Certainly continues to be plagued by some very serious rule of law deficits, but again is among the countries that has been consistently improving in recent years and with some significant improvements, particularly surrounding access to justice, combating corruption, and open government. So those are some examples, but again, I want to underscore that this is highly contextualized, and the most effective approach is frankly the kind of approach that you all have been pursuing with the Reconnect project to gather communities of scholars and practitioners to study matters carefully and in that context specific way, and develop recommendations that can incrementally strengthen checks and balances and open government and accountability and deliver justice for everyone.
Thank you very much again for this fascinating talk and for being open to our questions and to the discussion. Thank you also those of you in the audience who asked questions, and apologies from those of you whose answers couldn't fit into the time frame, but we will try to address them in the second part of the workshop. Ms. Anderson, also thank you very much, not only for this speech, but for all the work that you do. Selfishly, I thank you as an academic who relies to a great extent to your work, and thanks for helping to translate our academic findings into ordinary language and also into recommendations directed towards policymakers. So thank you again for being with us, and let me now change hats and together with Professor Pesch try to do the impossible in 15 minutes, summarize our findings and recommendations and treaty changes to strengthen the rule of law in Europe. Professor Pesch, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Petra, and let me add my thanks to our keynote speaker. I had quite a few questions, but hopefully I might be able to ask them on a different occasion. So thank you very much. Yes, my job is essentially to summarize in a couple of minutes some of our findings. I cannot be exhaustive because we have been working quite hard this past 48 months. Before I give you just a flavor of some of the most important findings we have made, perhaps I thought it'd be useful to quickly give you an overview of the structure of the research project so that you understand how many of us have been working on what rule of law issues. So just very briefly, in terms of the structure of the research project, the Reconnect project, two main working packages were entirely dedicated to the rule of law, with the first work package led by me and Dr. Joy Grogan, So we have been working on the key principles relating to the rule of law at EU and member state level. So this was the most conceptual work package entirely dedicated to the rule of law. The second work package was led by Dimitri and Barbara of CEU, Democracy Institute. They need no presentation, so let me just briefly explain what they've been working on. Essentially, primarily focusing on key practices implementing or undermining the rule of law across all levels of governance in the EU. In addition, one may mention a transversal package looking at citizens' perceptions of democracy and the rule of law in the EU, and another special work package whose agenda was completely adjusted in light of the COVID pandemic to assess the responses of national authorities to this pandemic, primarily from a rule of law point of view, and this work package was led by Dr. Grogan. So as I said, it's difficult to do justice to our research in 15 minutes when he has kept us busy for close to 48 months and resulted in many working papers, policy briefs, and blog posts. The rule of law team, so to speak, was quite extensive, so I cannot mention every single member. Plus, we've been working very closely with members of the International Advisory Board and friends of Reconnect, like Professor Chipelet and Professor Kellerman. But just to give you an idea of productivity, which I hope has delighted our supreme leader, Professor Wouters, on COVID only, Dr. Grogan has overseen the open access publication of more than 70 posts, thanks to a collaboration with Verfassung Blog and Democracy Reporting International, not to mention several webinars and multiple publications. That's just on COVID and the rule of law only. Now, finally, I'm returning to the issue of our main findings. As I said, I just cannot be exhaustive in a couple of minutes, but just let me mention a few key findings. First finding, contrary to what those threatening or violating the rule of law tend unsurprisingly to argue, we have found that the rule of law is in fact a well-established principle, which is well defined in its core meaning. This core legal meaning is furthermore shared across the EU, and the rule of law is one among the few overarching constitutional principles that can be together regarded as underlying all legal systems in Europe. So rather than a lack of definition, what has been problematic in our view is rather the proliferation of definitions in multiple documents of a variable legal nature. Another finding, contrary to what is often asserted, there we have found that there is no meaningful legal conceptual east-west divide, but rather an authoritarian liberal divide at an elite level. So in other words, there is a divide between national elites seeking to empty the rule of law of any core legally enforceable meaning, and those who aim, on the contrary, to defend the enforcement of this core meaning of the rule of law against the new breed of autocrats. Another finding of ours is that the EU is facing increasing and spreading rule of law backsliding within itself. I mean, the keynote speaker was quite, provided us with quite damning information in terms of the two, in fact, among the top 4 countries in this world which have dismantled, undermined the rule of law systematically and in a very intense way. We have Hungary and Poland, and she also mentioned Bosnia-Herzegovina. In other rankings, Serbia has also been mentioned as one of the countries whose authorities have dismantled checks and balances systematically in a very intense, on the basis of a very intensely implemented pattern. We have actually, perhaps I should make clear, we have also defined rule of law backsliding in our research, which we have presented or defined as a top-down orchestrated hollowing out of national checks and balances, primarily via the means and instruments of democratic decision-making at first. In light of the widely shared popular support for the rule of law, which we have also established, the conceptual challenge originating from authoritarian populists, that's another one of our findings. Well, the authoritarian challenge does not primarily target the concept of the rule of law as such, and that was also one of the findings made by the keynote speaker. Rather, they aim under the guise of concepts such as constitutional identity or constitutional pluralism to redefine the rule of law, but I would rather say not redefining simply, but to order out the rule of law of any meaningful identity or content. When it comes to addressing rule of law backsliding, which is now, I'm afraid, amounting to rule of law breakdown in at least one member state, so where lawlessness has replaced, in fact, the rule by law. Discursive-based procedures and reporting instruments have proved, as we have established, totally ineffective to prevent, let alone contain, rule of law backsliding. And contrary to what is often claimed, the EU's toolbox to support and correct rule of law rot has always been sufficiently comprehensive and sophisticated in nature to, at the very least, contain rule of law backsliding. And another one of our findings, the current rule of law toolbox is enough to do the job if the full set of tools it contains is used promptly, forcefully, and in a coordinated manner. Regarding COVID, and to mention one last finding before giving the floor back to Petra, the pandemic has shown that the importance of compliance with the rule of law during emergency, as legal uncertainty, questionable legality, wide delegation of powers, and sometimes discriminatory application of the law were common among member states and across the world. The pandemic has also been marked, essentially has reinforced pre-existing trends towards rule of law backsliding, which accelerated during the pandemic. Whether states have relied on emergency law or ordinary law, we have found is less significant for rule of law compliance than factors such as robust mechanisms for democratic scrutiny and ensuring the time-limited nature of highly discretionary and delegated powers. So as I said, this was just a flavor of some of our main findings. And now Petra is going to give us an overview, again, a non-exhaustive overview of our main recommendations. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Laurent. And indeed, I'm going to be selective. We were trying to think outside the box as well, as if there was a carte blanche in the European Union allowing us to change the treaties. And we were also thinking in terms of how to reform the system possibly within the existing treaty framework. So let me give you a glimpse of some of the ideas that we came up with. So research has borne out that the sine qua non of any legitimate EU response to rule of law decline or backsliding, but also to the promotion of the rule of law, is possible only through a thorough monitoring mechanism based on objective preset criteria, a qualitative contextual analysis, which should be a regular exercise based on the principle of equal treatment of the member states. This is partially already happening, for example, in the framework of the Commission's annual rule of law report, but that was preceded by another idea put forward by the European Parliament, which has the name DRF, the Democracy, Rule of Law and Fundamental Rights Pact, which is supposed to be more comprehensive, covering the main interconnected values that the European Union is based on. Now here the big question is, what if there is a negative finding in any of these monitoring mechanisms with regard to one or more European Union member states? And here we can distinguish two consequences. The first one would be the sanctions, and the second one would be other legal consequences attached to backsliding. I would start with the latter. There are certain prerequisites for the functioning of essential parts of European Union law, in particular in the internal market and the area of freedom, security, and justice. Most prominently, the principle of mutual recognition risks to work deficiently or to become simply inoperative if the foundations of the EU legal order do not function anymore. So if we cannot presuppose that every member state in the European Union has an impartial judiciary that respects, for example, the right to a fair trial, as it has been mentioned in the introductory talk as well. Now, in these cases, when this presumption is rebutted, essential presumptions and legal institutions of EU law should be suspended, such as, for example, mutual trust or automatic mutual recognition of criminal judgments should be replaced by a system of earned trust. This can happen even under the current treaty constellation, Article 70 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union, but it could also be the result of a all-encompassing monitoring mechanism. When it comes to the sanctions regime, of course, we should start with the famous or infamous Article 7 procedures, where the scope of application of the preliminary prong and the sanctioning prong of Article 7 could be clarified. The delayed start and triggering of Article 7 was mainly the result of political considerations, but the treaties are not flawless either. So what we are promoting is, for example, clarifying what amounts to a clear risk of a serious breach or a serious and persistent breach of fundamental values. Also, the voting rules could be amended, but it's only possible by treaty change, which seemed to be an insurmountable obstacle to actually triggering and making good use of the sanctioning prong of Article 7. It could also be made clear that Article 7.1 is not a prerequisite to trigger Article 7.2, or that the rule of law framework initiated by the Commission is also not a prerequisite for immediately going to the sanctioning prong if there is need to trigger that. Also, the open-ended nature of the provisions foreseen by Article 7 is problematic. So we just promote the expansion of the list of possible sanctions explicitly, and also to we were toying with the idea of allowing for the expulsion of a member state, which, by the way, also corresponds to citizens' expectations. Professor Pesch and I talked to citizens in the framework of the Conference on the Future of Europe, and this came up repeatedly as a possibility for the future. Of course, it should be ultima ratio, procedural safeguards should be there, and the rights and interests of EU citizens must enjoy a priority. Also, other procedures were foreseen by us, especially the infringement procedure could be renewed or altered. Could be rule of law related infringement procedures could be accelerated, interim measures should be used more extensively, heavier emphasis should be especially on enforcement, cases should be bundled in order to show at the systemic nature of rule of law violations, and there should be a commitment coming from the European Commission in case it's a member state suing another member state over rule of law issues. Preferably, the Commission should take over the case. Now, pinpointing the interconnectedness of democracy, fundamental rights, and the rule of law, we also came up with certain recommendations relating to fundamental rights breaches if they are stemming out from the Charter. We were propagating the idea of a constitutional complaint procedure, a Verfassungsbeschwerde, where people could directly access the Court of Justice of the European Union, which would be especially crucial in countries where the apex courts have already been captured, and also allowing judges to thematize in certain forms of proceedings national rules that prevent them from applying properly European Union law. It's partially already happening in the framework of preliminary references, but many questions are declared to be inadmissible. The Court of Justice hinting at the fact that these questions should be asked in the form of infringement proceedings, but infringement proceedings can only be started by the Commission or a member state, and if they don't make this step, then the questions will simply not be thematized in the European Union. Also, with regard to fundamental rights, we were propagating to revive the idea of making the Charter a federal standard, but by not only applying it to situations where member states act within European Union law or where they implement European Union law. And also the crucial point really is enforcement. However, since 22, 23 years passed since the drafting of the Charter, we also promote the idea of a conference on possibly reinserting or inserting new charter rights reflecting new social circumstances, such as, for example, the right to digital self-determination or a provision regarding the use of artificial intelligence and algorithms, ensuring that major decisions that affect individual rights will always be taken by a human being. And I stop here. I hope I offered a glance of at least what we are proposing in many of our papers, but I highly recommend you to look at work package 7, 8, and 15, because there our recommendations are summarized much more extensively, of course. Thank you very much. Now let me move to our next item on the agenda, and I have the special privilege to introduce you someone you of course know very well, namely Professor Ann Rosas, who will give us his testimony. But before he does that, let me just say a few words about him. Professor Rosas holds a Doctor of Laws of the University of Turku in Finland, was Professor of Law at the University of Turku and at the Abo Academy University, and was also Director at the Abo Academy University's Institute for Human Rights. He holds various international and national academic positions of responsibility and membership of learned societies. He coordinated several international and national research projects and programs, including in the fields of EU law, international law, humanitarian law, human rights law, constitutional law, comparative public administration. He served in governmental law commissions and committees of the Finnish Parliament, as well as UN, UNESCO, OSCE, Council of Europe. He was principal legal advisor at the Legal Service of the European Commission in charge of external relations. He was Deputy Director General of the European Commission Legal Service, and as you will all know, judge at the Court of Justice between 2002 and 2019. He's also a member of the Independent Committee that advises the European Commission in ethical matters. Now today, Professor Rosas was invited in his capacity as a member of the Article 255 panel. The panel was created by the Lisbon Treaty and is charged with the task of giving an opinion on candidate suitability to perform the duties of judges and Advocate General of the Court of Justice and the General Court before the governments of the member states make their appointments. The panel ensures that the candidates nominated by the member states meet the eligibility criteria under European Union law. So over to Professor Rosas now.
You see as the most significant developments concerning the rule of law in the Union and its member states?
Well, I think that despite all the difficulties, if we look at things from a broader time perspective, things have gone in the right direction. If I may, I could start with a personal memory. I studied law in Turku, Finland in the late 1960s. And I have to say, at least based on what I can remember from that time, that questions of the rule of law, including questions of independence, impartiality of courts and so on, was certainly mentioned, but it was not highlighted as far as I can remember. And still in the 1960s, at least in Finland, but I suspect that that has been a little bit the same situation in many other countries as well. Judges were seen, at least to some extent, as civil servants, as servants of the state. And the task was to implement the will of the state rather than to protect the rights of individuals. I'm probably exaggerating in saying this, but I think it captures something essential, that it's only later in Finland, it was only maybe during the 1980s when Finland started to become bound by international human rights conventions that the role of a judge gradually changed. And then if we look at the European Union more broadly, I think one can say that particularly the Lisbon Treaty, which only entered into force 1st December 2009, underline the importance of the rule of law and the right to an independent judge and to a fair trial and so on has gained ground. And then later on, obviously, if you look at the case law of the European Court of Justice today, a great number of important cases have been dealt with during the last years and are still being dealt with today. And we of course have all these problems also relating to the situation in some member states and the disagreements between them and other member states and the EU institutions in Brussels. But I wanted to remind ourselves of the fact that if we look at things from a sort of 50 years perspective, I think things have been going rather in the positive direction.
Thank you. Speaking from your unique perspective as a judge at the Court of Justice, what do you think the EU can do better to promote and enhance the rule of law in the Union and its member states?
Well, I would say as a personal opinion that I think we now have more or less, I'm stressing the words more or less, the mechanisms. There is Article 7 of the Union Treaty, which of course is difficult to use because there's a unanimity requirement which is built in there, but it is at least a mechanism that can be started by the European Parliament or the European Commission, and it certainly may have a certain influence, even if because of the unanimity requirement or some other reason it's not brought to an end with really formal sanctions. But there are a lot of other things available. There are of course political discussions especially in the Council and in discussions between the European Commission and member states. There's the infringement procedure, Commission versus member states, which can end up in the Court of Justice and not only end up in the Court of Justice with a binding judgment, but also a sort of a second trial in case that judgment is not being implemented properly. And in that case, the court also can inflict financial sanctions against the member state concerned. And then there's the new conditionality regulation, which also gives some possibility to the Commission not to pay out certain funds if there are rule of law problems in a member state which may affect the use of those funds. So meaning in more concrete terms cases of corruption and the like that are not properly being investigated. And of course, some people say money talks. So the fact that this conditionality regulation may lead to a member state being deprived of EU funds that it would otherwise be entitled to also should have a certain effect. So I think the combined effect of all these means that there are mechanisms and that it is, at least to some extent, a question then of political will, to what extent they are being used. I think I would just add that what is very important is that all member states also see their responsibility, and that member states are not only counting on the Court of Justice in Luxembourg or the Commission in Brussels to do everything in this sphere, but also to exert their own influence, mainly within the Council of Ministers, if they feel that another member state is violating the foundational principles of the rule of law.
You are the president of the Article 255 committee. Can you explain how this committee came to be and what its main tasks are?
Well, I think the background is the following. According to the EU treaties, it is for each member state to propose a judge, and depending on which member state is in question, also an advocate general for the Court of Justice. And in the past, it was simply a government proposal. There was no requirement of any internal procedures for coming up with this proposal, and at the EU level, it was a decision, a joint decision of all the member states. And as is often the case in such intergovernmental circumstances, member states tend not to intervene in proposals that their fellow member states, so to speak, have put forward. And so the normal case was that the member state proposal was accepted as such, and that person was then appointed. And that could mean that the person was not chosen in any procedure. There was at least no open procedure. People did not have to apply, and it could have been a little bit unclear for what reasons a certain proposal had been made, and that, to be frank, also made it possible to take into account both party political considerations and maybe sometimes, at least the system sort of made it possible to propose a candidate that was not as qualified as many other candidates would have been in that same member state. And this was increasingly seen as a problem. I remember when I was myself appointed in 2002, I felt, to be very frank, a little bit embarrassed, because at that time in Finland there were no national procedures and there was no procedure at the EU level either. And so the Lisbon Treaty that I mentioned before, that entered into force in December 2009, introduced this so-called 255 committee. The name comes from the number of the article in the treaty and the functioning of the European Union, which deals with the establishment of this committee. It's in English called a panel, in fact, and its task is to screen the candidate in singular that the member state in question, that the government of the member state in question has put forward, in order to decide whether that person, in the view of the panel, is qualified enough. It consists of 7 members, which are appointed by the Council on the proposal of the President of the European Court of Justice. The majority of the members in practice have been national judges, so presidents of Supreme Courts or members of national constitutional courts or the like, and 2 or 3 members have been former members of the European Court of Justice and the General Court, which is the former court of first instance. So this is an independent panel that then gives an opinion. The opinion is not legally binding, formally speaking, but so far at least the opinion has always been followed. So if the panel has given a negative opinion on a certain candidate, then the member state in question has withdrawn the candidature, or the candidate himself or herself has decided to withdraw his or her consent, and later the government has put forward a new proposal, which then either has been approved or not approved by the panel. And I would say that the main, maybe, importance or the main function of the committee is on the preventive side. In other words, now when member states are aware of this process, and they also see that in many cases there may be negative opinions, most member states have installed some sort of national procedures. In some member states with a very open public procedure to apply for becoming a candidate, and that has then probably had the effect of making it less easy to appoint somebody who has not really done law, so to speak, even if the person has had a law degree but has never been either a practicing lawyer or a judge or a law professor or anything like that, but simply happens to be a friend of somebody. So I would say that has probably been the most important sort of role of the panel.
Thank you. To what extent do the committee's recent opinions on a candidate's suitability to be a judge or advocate general at the court take account of rule of law principles?
Well, first of all, I think all the criteria that the committee is using for screening the candidates, and these criteria, by the way, published in the report of activities of the panel. The next report will come out in maybe 1 or 2 weeks. And I could say that all the more or less 5 criteria that the committee or panel is using, like professional experience, professional background, knowledge of EU law and of the procedures in the Luxembourg courts, and so on and so forth. All these put together certainly are related to the considerations of the rule of law. In other words, the idea is to try to contribute to a process where the most qualified, or at least very sufficiently qualified persons are appointed judges or advocate general. But I can add that the last criteria that the committee is looking at is also whether more concretely there are any concerns about the possible non-independence, non-impartiality of a certain candidate. So it is certainly also in that more concrete sense part of the picture.
We are extremely grateful to Professor Ann Rosas, President of the Article 255 Committee, for his personal testimony, and also to Professor Axel Marx from Catholic University of Leuven for traveling to Bruges last week and asking questions and recording this interview. And now we should move to our rule of law panel discussion with our most distinguished guests, colleagues, and friends. First, Professor Kim-Lane Shapley from Princeton University will give us a general overview about the state of the art of the rule of law in the European Union. Professor Daniel Kellerman from Rutgers University will talk about the value clashes in the EU and the member states. Professor Dmitry Kochanov from the Central European University and the Central European University's Democracy Institute will talk about the rule of law, which is to be respected also at the EU level. Dr. Joel Grogan from Middlesex University will address COVID-19 and the rule of law at both the EU and member state level. Dr. Marta Pardavi will represent and talk about civil society and the interconnected values of the rule of law and human rights at the member state level. And we will close the discussion by Professor John Moraine from the University of Groningen, who will hold a forward-looking presentation about what Reconnect has taught us. Because of the brevity of the time, we suggest 5-minute interventions in the first round, and then move to the audience's questions to be moderated by Professor Pesch. But first, Professor Chapelet, the floor is yours, please.
Great, thank you so much. So given a task of overview in 5 minutes, what I plan to do is give you a dizzying recollection of the last 10 years and sort of how we've come to be where we are. The story I want to tell is a tale of two Europes. One is a Europe on paper, in which over the last 10 years, an extraordinary number of new instruments, a huge jurisprudence of the Court of Justice, a whole series of new tools have been developed. And then there's Europe, as our students say, IRL, in real life, in which, frankly, on the ground, not nearly as much has changed as has changed on paper. So let me give you the dizzying overview. Let's start with the Barroso Commission, which was dealing with the financial crisis, which was always seen as an existential threat to Europe. And during the Barroso crisis, during the Barroso Commission, also the Barroso crisis, Viktor Orban came to power in 2010 and very quickly started to eliminate checks on his powers. Brussels was concerned. The European Parliament was concerned. The Commission was concerned. The European Parliament passed its first resolution in 2011 on the new media law. The new constitution that went into effect in 2012 was drafted in 2011, produced a flurry of activity from the Commission in which they brought an infringement action over the forced retirement of judges, over the political replacement of the data protection officer. They threatened to bring an action on the loss of independence of the central bank, which was negotiated into sort of a bit of a compromise. The Court of Justice kind of rose to the occasion, but the fact is that none of it made any difference, actually. And what you could see in that first flurry of activity of the Orban government was that the Parliament came out in front as the lead institution that really was on top of things and made, and sort of understood what was happening in real time. Parliament passed the Tavares report in 2013 that provided the first real comprehensive indictment of democratic backsliding in Hungary, with recommendations to the Commission and Council to act. But they did nothing. And in fact, that's kind of the template for what's happened in the last decade. And if you go back and read the Tavares report now, you'll see it is just as fresh now as it was then, which is to say, virtually everything that was mentioned in that report is still problematic now. The Barroso Commission left office in what has now become a familiar pattern by saying, well, actually, we would have done more, but we need new tools. And as they were leaving, they proposed and put into effect both the Justice Scoreboard, which was actually mentioned in the Elizabeth Anderson presentation earlier today, which is to say a way of documenting judicial efficiency that may or may not have anything to do with the rule of law in any substantive sense. And they put into place something they called the rule of law framework, because Article 7, the procedure for potentially suspending voting rights and other things for rogue member states, had already put a warning procedure into Article 7, and this was the prequel to the warning procedure. All right, so the Commission left with new tools. The Juncker Commission came in. It was dealing with the migration crisis, which was also thought to be more important. The thing to note about the rule of law crisis is that it was consistently the second or third ranked crisis all the way through this period, which meant that it never got prioritized, I think, the way it might have. And Frans Timmermans took the rule of law portfolio, Hungary had its first of now 3 free but not fair elections, although the last one was not so free. And in the course of Hungary steadily getting worse, the new government in Poland came in and immediately started attacking the judiciary. Frankly, the commission had its highest moment at this point, where Frans Timmermans led the commission in what was a really extraordinary set of dialogues at first, invoking this rule of law framework, and then following with a reasoned opinion to the council to invoke Article 7, which is something that, again, it went to the council and in the meantime, preoccupied with Poland, the commission ignored all the backsliding in Hungary, which continued. So there were a set of infringement actions brought, all of which were symbolically important, none of which crucially changed facts on the ground. And even with regard to finally bringing infringements, the Juncker Commission led by Frans Timmermans probably had the best track record of trying to spot judicial independence problems as they went along, but most of the time the commission's actions were too little, too late. And again, the council remained silent. The parliament passed a number of resolutions. So on Hungary, June 2015, December 2015, and finally in September 2018, the Sargentini report invoked Article 7.1 against Hungary, passed the parliament with the requisite supermajority, and still remains a detailed account of everything wrong in Hungary, none of which has been fixed. And so at the end of the Juncker Commission, what you saw was, again, a lot of flurry of activity without much changing on the ground. And as we've now seen, every exiting commission says, we would have done more if we'd had more tools. And so the exiting Juncker Commission proposed this rule of law report that Petra mentioned, in which not just the rogue states that everybody knows about, but every single member state now has to complete a kind of rule of law assessment. That does wonderfully if what you're interested in is differential treatment of member states. But what it does is it ties up a huge amount of the commission's hours, brain power, person power in simply producing these reports for every member state, all of which lead to basically so far toothless recommendations. The more crucial thing that the Juncker Commission proposed on the way out was the rule of law conditionality regulation. And the point of that originally was to find a way to withhold money from rogue member states because they had gone rogue. And in the course of the legislative process, the offending member states, namely Hungary and Poland, with some of their allies, were able to water this regulation down to the point where by the time it passed, it became not a kind of general rule of law kind of punishment mechanism, but it became mostly an anti-corruption tool with rule of law still in its title. Okay, finally, I'm almost done. Von der Leyen Commission comes in. They had to deal with the COVID crisis and now Ukraine, all of which were judged to be more important than the rule of law crisis. You see the pattern. Every commission has its own distinctive crisis that it puts ahead of rule of law and uses that as a reason not to act very forcefully. So the von der Leyen Commission came in and quite spectacularly dropped the ball on both Hungary and Poland, which is to say, really stopped enforcing rule of law conditionality in the member states. They allowed the Polish government to drag its feet and refuse to comply. The commission has slow walked infringements, even in outrageous cases like the disciplinary chamber or the constitutional court that just said it didn't have to follow EU law. It has failed to bring infringements in cases where it might have, and that's only with regard to Poland. Hungary, perhaps maybe Hungary is just thought to be a lost cause, but the commission has never done what it should have done. It's brought important cases on asylum and gay rights, which play into Orban's argument that the EU mostly wants a culture war, while simultaneously ignoring the kind of checks and balances and judicial independence issues, which are absolutely crucial. And now, last week, finally after the Hungarian election, the Commission has finally triggered the conditionality regulation against Hungary, but we have yet to see exactly where that's going to go. Is that going to be a mere, kind of cautionary note, or is that really going to be a serious problem? So what we can say about this is that the European Parliament has stepped up to its challenges and passed resolution after resolution, but of course it has not very much power to accomplish anything. The Court of Justice in all these cases that have finally been brought has actually, I always criticize the court because I always think it could do more, but if you look over the last 10 years, it's been nothing but extraordinary, the body of law that the court has developed. But where are we after all of this? Hungary is no longer a democracy, but is a hybrid regime. And Poland has become a semi-consolidated democracy. As Elizabeth Anderson mentioned earlier, these are two countries that have fallen so far, so fast in international comparison. And while there's been this immense proliferation of tools and occasional flurries of activity, mostly there's been not effective action at EU level. And so I just say we are a Europe, we have two Europes, a Europe on paper in which the rule of law has become a prominent and important issue over the last 10 years, and a rule of law in real life, which unfortunately is still failing in many of our member states. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And Professor Kellerman, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks very much. And thanks to the whole Reconnect team for having me today and at some of your previous events, and just for the incredible work you've done over these 4 years. It is hard to believe it's wrapping up. I'll be very quick, 5 minutes, we said. So my task was I was asked to discuss value clashes in a quasi-federal entity, namely the clashes between the values of democracy and autocracy that are at the center of the issues we're discussing today. So I think really what I should do there, my task is to sort of summarize, based on the work I've done in recent years, what we can learn about the EU's rule of law and autocracy crisis by comparing it with and drawing on the experience of federal systems. And I apologies to those of you who've seen me talk about this before, but I'll be brief. Basically, I want to focus on 4 lessons from the academic literature on federalism concerning such value clashes and from the experiences of other countries. So those 4 lessons will be, number 1, we should not be surprised by the emergence of autocratic states within the EU who flout rule of law. This happens all over the place in democratic unions, all over the world. Second, the situation is worse in the EU than in other systems, than in full federal states. Third, if left untreated, this cancer of autocracy will metastasize and cause further problems throughout the union, threatening its very existence. Fourth, and finally, uncharacteristically for me, I will end with a note of hope. First, democratic unions around the world, as I said, have autocratic member states. So it shouldn't surprise us that this would happen in the EU. We've seen this all over the place in the United States in our history, in Mexico, Argentina, many countries around the world where otherwise democratic unions have certain states that are autocratic. And as I've written about in my work, this happens in the EU for the same reasons it happens elsewhere. Local autocrats are protected by political allies at the federal level. I could say more about that in the discussion, but that's also happened in the EU. Secondly, money from the center, in this case, EU funding, supports the local autocrat. And finally, emigration is a big factor where dissatisfied citizens can leave and move to other parts of the union. So all these things are familiar from other unions, and they all have played a role in the EU in sustaining the emergence of autocratic regimes. Second point, the situation is unfortunately worse in the EU than in any of these other federal systems for 2 main reasons. First, the EU is much more intergovernmental than any other sort of federal entity, meaning both that these autocrats, where they emerge, can wield vetoes in many fora within the EU, something that isn't typical in federal systems. And also just normatively, there's strong norms of non-intervention in the domestic political affairs of other member states that make central institutions, more reluctant to act. Second reason it's worse in the EU is citizens don't really know this is happening. The problems in other member states, speaking other languages, et cetera, they feel distant. And so citizens in other member states are less likely to demand action from their leaders than they would be if this was happening in the context of a country. Third point, if left untreated, the cancer will metastasize. And that should be no surprise. It's as true in politics as in medicine. And by metastasize, I don't just mean that other autocrats or aspiring autocrats will see the playbook that's been deployed and emulate it. Yes, that will happen. But the other thing that will happen is the autocrats will attack the center, right? They will not be content to run their petty mafia state fiefdom in their own country. They will try to make the union safe for autocracy by infiltrating central institutions, planting their people in positions of power, and making it an autocratic, safe union. Fourth and finally, my very last point, there is hope. This literature suggests that as bad as it is in the EU, there is hope. But one thing I think we can't do is there's a temptation, and Jan Werner Muller had a nice piece in Foreign Affairs today talking about this. There's an understandable temptation, and I think this is in the minds of many EU leaders, where they think, well, look, ultimately, this is up to the people in these countries to correct these problems. We can't fix it for them, right? But that is very wrong-headed and unfair, because it is not as though the EU is neutral in this regard, just letting the different political forces in these countries play it out. No, the EU is actively subsidizing autocracy and rule of law backsliding. In fact, I haven't kind of calculated this, but I'm pretty sure we would find that the EU is the biggest funder of democracy or democratic backsliding in the world. Just think about the comments, from our keynote speaker, Dr. Anderson, about how 3 of the 4 fastest or most dramatic backsliders in their indices were either EU members or candidates. That's not a coincidence. It's because they're being funded by the EU to do this. So then the final thing, though, the hope is that the literature shows that you can dislodge these autocrats, but the key is to break their boundary control, as Ed Gibson calls it, which means the grip of the autocrat on that state must be broken. And the way that must happen goes back to everything my friend and co-author, Professor Scheppele, just talked about, showing the failure of the European institutions to act. Well, that is what must be overcome, that only when central institutions actively decide they're going to denounce the autocrat and intervene to support the opposition will this situation change. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And after these 2 great introductories, let us move to the EU level and the responsibility of the EU to respect the rule of law. Professor Kochanov, the floor is yours.
It is an absolute honor to be here with such a distinguished panel, and my task is probably a more unusual one, because we always speak about Hungary, Poland, and other backsliding member states, also looking at the tools that the EU has at its disposal in order to deal with what's going on wrong. But I will build on my work together with Barbara Grabowska-Moros over these years, that looks at the practices at the European Union level as well, as far as the adherence to the basic rule of law principle is concerned. And this is mostly based on a book chapter which we have just published in Anti-Constitutional Pluralism, a book that Professor Krieger, together with Sadursky and Chernota, edited for Cambridge University Press. So we make basically 2 points, which are both of them speaking directly to the keynote speech that we have heard, and to what Kim and Daniel have told us already. In terms of effectiveness,
the European Union has not been a poster child of the fight for the rule of law. So all these years have not resulted actually in any kind of backtracking of the autocrats. In fact, rather the contrary seems to be true. So on this, I absolutely agree with Professor Shapiro and Professor Kellerman. So what we observe at the supranational level, it seems, given all the amazing case law of the Court of Justice on the rule of law, is that the Union is reforming its constitutional system using this backsliding in a way as a pretext. So it's unquestionable that the Union has radically different powers to intervene and a radically different set of tools to intervene right now, many years after backsliding has started. But the deployment of these tools, in particular in Poland and in particular in Hungary, has not brought us any results, unfortunately. So there is one winner here, and this winner seems to be the general idea of the Union, not as an effective rule of law upholder, but as a union which is more powerful than it used to be before the rule of law crisis started, simply because of the power grab, which I don't mean necessarily negatively. The Union can do more, but the Union has not done more. And the second point is that once we move this to the democracy level, it's clear that this lacking effectiveness is also observable democratically, and this is what we heard from the keynote. People don't see the EU as a democratically accountable institution simply because it's not. And then we know that it's not a promoter of the rule of law if we look at the effectiveness of its achievements, at what the union has done. Let's now look at how the new revolutionary case law of the Court of Justice works at the supranational level. And here again, unfortunately, I have bad news for all of us. And the examples are plentiful, because it seems like the rule of law has been largely deployed as a carte blanche in order to always underline the principle of supremacy, rather than any kind of checks inherent in the system on the authority of EU law. And in fact, the rule of law as such, as a principle, in fact, does not work as a passepartout to whitewash what those who are in power intend to do within their constitutional system. And together with Barbara, we picked a number of examples in this paper, but we published plenty of other papers, of course, in the context of this amazing Reconnect journey. And the most telling case, of course, would be a statement by the Court of Justice itself in direct violation of its own case law, as well as the case law, admittedly, of the European Court of Human Rights, where the court says that it doesn't have the powers to review the abuse of power of the member states, even when the member states act outright in breach of the treaties, and in fact directly attack the court. So the Court of Justice, unlike the Polish courts, took the side of those in power as opposed to their own colleagues. And I speak about the Advocate General Sharpston cases where potentially unlawful appointment has been made, and the Court of Justice has not applied its own principles, which were designed for Poland and Hungary, to its own composition. And then we can proceed from there and find other examples. The most worrisome, and probably Laurent Pech would be better positioned to speak about that one, is the definition of a lawful judge, which is deployed by the Court of Justice, as opposed to national courts, especially in Poland, and as opposed to the European Court of Human Rights. So by accepting questions from the unlawfully appointed people who parade as judges in the so-called courts in Poland, the Court of Justice actually does not only deviate from its case law, it also potentially legitimizes the attacks on the rule of law at the national level. So potentially there is a lot of room for improvement there. And then other fields outside of the independence of the judiciary and the rule of law proper offer plentiful other examples which allow to underline the same potentially dangerous trend, namely the emergence of a double standard in the field of the rules of law and values when we look at the supranational level as opposed to the national level. And of course, we all heard about the pushbacks at the border about the institutionalized racism de facto of how the European Union deals with those who are the displaced person who are most in need. So the barbed wire fence between Poland and Belarus is still standing, the place where children were dying in the wintry forest, and the Commission hasn't brought a single action. While people with fairer skin, of course, welcome into the Union, and special legislation has been put in place to welcome them. And of course, the Turkey deal, Opinion 213, plenty of examples can be cited in order to show that the Union, in fact, does not always act as it preaches. And obviously, this is something that will have to be corrected sooner or later. If not, well, and will especially need to be defended in front of the Court of Human Rights when these radical differences in the understanding of the principles by the Court of Justice and by the Court of Human Rights will be tested in front of that panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dimitri. And now over to Dr. Grogan, who has overseen the open access publication of 76 posts, thanks to our collaboration in the framework of Reconnect with Verfassungsblog and Democracy Reporting International, not to mention 7 webinars, 5 chapters, 3 academic articles, 2 policy papers, and an edited volume that she contributed it. Shall, the floor is yours.
What an introduction. Can I first echo my dear friends and colleagues and say what a privilege it is to be part of this panel. I've had the joy of working with everyone here for the last 4 years, and I can only regret that it is now finishing, but can look forward to sharing the legacy of the Reconnect project. I did focus my own work on the COVID-19 pandemic over the last 2 years within the context of rule of law and democracy, and it is within that frame that I'm going to be offering these short remarks. I think if we discuss the legacy of pandemic, it's not only the fact that we are all very familiar now with Zoom protocols, but we can also understand many of the critical rule of law issues that have been exposed. For example, in the context of legal certainty, not knowing what rules apply to us at any one time, but also legality, where governments throughout the EU have acted without clear legal basis. These are very common legal issues that stretch beyond, as Laurent Pech mentioned earlier, in the context also of discriminatory application of laws, and also a lack of access to justice in the context of COVID-19 measures. What I can say is that while these critical rule of law issues were familiar, if not common, throughout the European Union, we've certainly seen capitalizing by some governments, by autocratizing governments, I've been saying that word so much over the last 4 years, who have capitalized on the situation of the pandemic to further trends. In this context, I can say not only in the findings of the research, findings of the Reconnect project research, but also echoing our keynote speaker, that the COVID-19 pandemic did not so much change governments as reveal them, as expose pre-existing trends. These pre-existing trends continued throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. What we can also say on the basis of our findings, which focused not only within the EU context, but also did look throughout the world, we looked at over 60 countries throughout the world, is that everyone, democracies and autocracies, proved equally and unpredictably vulnerable to the COVID-19 pandemic. But despite this, we also see that governments that have responded, that have inculcated rule of law principles, have somewhat correlated with better responses, with more efficacious responses to pandemic. So on the basis of our research, what lessons can we draw? Well, I would say that 3 key points I'd like to bring out within these short remarks are, first, that we need to learn from pandemic. We need to learn from the experience of the last 2 years. It's so tempting for EU governments, and I'm already seeing it as I discuss with them, the idea of moving on, moving quickly on, this political incentive to say what is done, let's not think about it again. The second lesson that we must draw is to reform our law, to reform our provisions and our frameworks and our models, our use of power, and also our oversight mechanisms with the rule of law in mind. This can guarantee a more efficacious response to future emergency, be it a health emergency or very likely a security crisis or an environmental crisis. A final lesson that I would also say is that whatever preparation that we do make, we must also be aware that governance in the moment of emergency matters just as much as the preparation for that emergency. Those governments that have acted with rule of law in mind, making sure they are certain in their actions, transparent in their reasoning, and also acting on clear legal basis by engaging with other parties, by engaging with the mechanisms of democracy, by engaging in healthy public institutions, they do better through crisis. So preparing for governance and acting with democracy, with rule of law through emergency is ultimately the most effective response to crisis. We've seen that on the basis of the Reconnect research. I haven't had enough coffee today. This is why I am falling over my words this evening. So please do forgive me. And I also hear a baby crying in the background. So it's been quite a day here in London. But essentially, when we act with democracy, when we act with rule of law, and when we expect those who govern us to act with democracy and act with rule of law, we have a more effective response to crisis. This is a clear lesson of the Reconnect project. And with that, I pass back to our wonderful MCs.
Thank you very much, Joelle. I very much appreciate it, and say hi to the youngest edition of the Reconnect consortium. Without further ado, I hand over to the co-chair of another ally of ours, so the Hungarian Helsinki Committee, Dr. Fardavi. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Petra, and thank you very much to all of you, not only for inviting me as a representative of a human rights organization, but also for all the work that you have done throughout this project. I think the Reconnect project not only really advanced our understanding and appreciation and desire to act for the rule of law, but it also connected communities. And there's been so many opportunities for me and colleagues from a variety of human rights organizations, civil society organizations around the EU to discuss with you and benefit from your work. So it's been essential. And I really appreciate that. I also appreciate the fact that your interpretation of the rule of law has always been very comprehensive. And you have also put so much effort and emphasis on democracy and fundamental rights as the two other inherent ingredients for a healthy rule of law ecosystem. And in the same vein, of course, civil society has also, I think, always defined itself as both a contributor to the rule of law and also one that relies on it, such an essential ingredient for civil society. We, as organizations, civil society is, of course, extremely diverse in Europe, and we can talk a lot about what kind of roles civil society plays. But when it comes to the rule of law and the focus of the Reconnect project, I just want to mention a few ways that we interact. Many civil society organizations around the European Union, of course, promote rule of law. They use it in their everyday work. They use it to hold governments accountable, to ensure that the rights of citizens are respected, that rule of law itself as an institution is not eroded, or that the erosion, the degradation is uncovered and documented. We use the rule of law toolbox of the European Union. We actually are dependent on it and are oftentimes not satisfied with it and call for better enforcement, better implementation, enhanced standards. But we also rely on rule of law and institutions because inherently civil society needs a few key things, but these are really essential to thrive. We need, of course, the freedom of peaceful assembly, the freedom of association, the freedom of expression. And on top of all these rights, we need active citizens who are empowered to participate in a democracy. And we see every single one of these key ingredients under pressure. It's been researched and documented quite a lot in the recent years by both the EU Fundamental Rights Agency, but other actors, how civic space has come under pressure. It is under pressure globally, as Civicus, the very prominent NGO that focuses on civil society and its rights, points out. But sadly, we also see through the Civicus report, the last focusing on 2021, how there's a notable decline in also well-established democracies, such as the UK and France. And of course, there's a number of EU member states where Civicus has documented incidents or trends of concern that mean that civic space is eroding. For example, in Poland, Civicus has designated the Polish civil society space as now obstructed, moving it down the ranking from narrowed. In Belgium and the Czech Republic, the open designation has been downgraded to narrowed. And there's a number of cases, and I'll just highlight a few from around the EU where member states have seen worrying trends, ones that go beyond the ones that are so often mentioned in Hungary and Poland. So for example, the right to peaceful assembly is very often one of the most vulnerable and has been under attack by either banning of assemblies or using excessive police force or discriminately prohibiting or enforcing the right to assembly. Another aspect is media independence, something that we usually treat quite differently. It's such a huge topic, of course. It is very much connected to the rule of law, but it is a separate issue as such. But we also see how a free, plural, healthy media environment, the ability for journalists to do their work, is essential for civil society and for the rule of law. This has been under pressure in the Czech Republic, in Slovenia, and of course, we should always think of Hungary and Poland whenever we talk about these examples. Sadly, the whole array of civic space pressures is evident there. When we talk about active citizens, we of course also need an environment that does not send out chilling effect, a stigmatizing narrative against participation in democratic processes. And I think it's also partly thanks to the Reconnect project that we have now a much better understanding of what this chilling effect actually means and how to use it and how to identify it. We don't always need the outrageous acts of atrocities that we often see in autocracies to be able to identify the traces of it in the EU. And the chilling effect notion has been, I think, instrumental, and it has become sadly a household term in addition to shrinking civic space for many. Now, these kinds of pressures are everywhere in the EU. Some national settings are, of course, are more healthy, but we see strains, little seeds of concern everywhere. And it's very obvious that civil society is pushing back against this by mobilizing. But it cannot be successful on its own. It needs institutions and it needs governments and it needs the EU institutions particularly to support the pushback against this backsliding. Protecting civil society space is obviously not only important for the citizens themselves, but also for the EU to strengthen its legitimacy, to secure public trust, and to help enact the unavoidable transitions that the European Union is facing as part of being a global actor. And so how to go about this, there's a lot of discussion, and a group of human rights defenders, which I'm involved in, called the Recharging Advocacy for Rights in Europe project, has come together to add to the discussion about how to fortify civic space in the EU. There is a very lengthy set of recommendations, and I'd like to only highlight a few that really pertain to the rule of law. But it's important to note that some of these recommendations, of course, will be the same ones that the Reconnect project has focused on so much. So when we look at the rule of law report, the annual report of the European Commission, we have also, of course, focused quite a lot on making sure that there would be ample, sufficient attention paid to civic space, the situation of civic space in EU member states, and what should be done to stop the weakening or to further its strengthening, and how the European Commission has an important role in this also through the rule of law report by devoting specific attention to this in the report and making sure that there are recommendations which then will be followed up. And these recommendations in the future, our proposals should be discussed before they are made by the Commission. Today, we don't know how the Commission will, of course, in this year's report formulate these recommendations, as this will be the first year, but it's important to ensure that the recommendations are such that are endorsed by those affected, and that they can follow up and hand in hand with the Commission, make sure that those will be implemented. Beyond this policy change, there's legislative changes that we're proposing at EU level. And here again, the European Parliament was, of course, pioneering with its efforts. There's 2 reports which have been recently adopted in the European Parliament, on one on shrinking civic space, and the other on a specific proposal that the Commission hopefully will take up to propose legislation that would allow for civil society organizations to have harmonized minimum standards across the European Union, and also a transnational EU status for European associations. Both of these legislative ideas are meant, I think, to protect a very significant vulnerability in the freedom of association today in the EU, while the report on shrinking civic space also calls for the European Commission to adopt a strategy on European civil society. And this is something that this Recharging Advocacy for Rights in Europe project also endorses. It would be important to not only have a piecemeal approach, but something that is an architecture in itself that would address the very core idea of a democracy, that we need active citizens to participate in processes. We need them to understand our democratic institutions, and we want them to demand the protection of these democratic institutions. And so a comprehensive strategy would address all of these aspects of participation, of consultation, of legal protection, and also, of course, the resources that the EU should devote to ensuring that democracy, fundamental rights, and rule of law are effectively upheld by citizens and their organizations in Europe. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion.
Thank you very much, Marta. And I hand over to Professor Moraine, who is also with us in his capacity as a member of the Mayor's Committee, and perhaps will say a few words about how, in this capacity, he can make use of Reconnect materials. So, John, over to you.
Many thanks for the invitation. I have to say it fills me with sadness to be the very last speaker on my very last panel on a Reconnect event. I learned a lot from each of the people on the panel here, and normally you would be introduced as last but not least, but this is definitely not the case. I'm not ashamed to be the least of all the speakers here, and hopefully we'll be able to continue our cooperation after this great project will have terminated. So I was asked to speak a little bit about some of the things that I have personally learned from Reconnect. And I want to divide that in 3 things. First, substance, reconnect what. Second, method, reconnect how. And then how to take Reconnect forward will be the 3rd lesson. And there, indeed, I'll talk a little bit about some of the things that I've been doing in my other capacity as a member of the Mayor's Committee, and where I've worked with one of the partners that Dr. Grogan also partnered up with, Democracy Reporting International. So let me start with the substance question, the what. I think that Professor Wouters and the other keynote speaker already stressed, and I agree with that, what this project has shown us is the relevance of not talking about rule of law in isolation, but actually doing that in connection with democracy and the rule of law, but not only at the EU level, but also when it comes to the relation of the EU level and the national level. The second thing that I want to highlight, and that was already very much stressed by Professor Scheppele. What you learn from this project is that there is really no need for new instruments. I think that the EU has an instrument problem, but that problem is that it has too many instruments and that we are using the wrong instruments. But it's definitely, we should avoid that the successor of the von der Leyen Commission comes to the same conclusion as Professor Scheppele drew, that we need somehow more instruments. I don't think that that is the case at all. I also think that what we have learned from this in terms of substance is that we need to be more aware. I think we are aware, we need to be even more aware that the other side connects or rather deconstructs elements of the rule of law, democracy, and human rights in a predictable playbook. There is indeed a populist playbook. And you know, in my country, we have a famous philosopher, Johan Cruyff, who said that you only start seeing it once you get it. And for me, it has also taken me a couple of years to really have it sink in that there is really a playbook, and in fact, that there is a predictability to actions of the Hungarian and Polish government. And to that, I would add that, in fact, we need a playbook too. We think that we have clarified things. We need to be able to verbalize more clearly, also to a lay public, what our alternative playbook is, the playbook that is actually laid down in binding law. And I'll come back to that in the third part of my brief talk. So then, as to method, what have I learned from Reconnect in terms of method? You'll be surprised, but I think what I've learned is that there's 28 EU rule of law debates. And I'm not making the mistake of still thinking that Dr. Grogan lives in the EU member state. But that I mean one EU rule of law debate that is at the EU level, but 27 parallel EU rule of law debates that take place in each of the national member states. And these are different. We tend to focus in this type of research projects on the Euro bubble only. And you know, we run the risk of preaching for the converted. But over the last 2-3 years, I spoke to media from what probably already amounts to a qualified majority in the council from all over Europe, and you have to explain the same thing in very different ways. I think that this is an important lesson to draw in terms of methods. You need European cooperation, but you also need to break these common findings down in a way that resonates in Latvia, in the Netherlands, in Belgium, in Malta, in Portugal. That's important. It's extremely hard, and one of the things that also makes it necessary, that necessitates this, is also that you need to speak in different languages than just English. I'll come back to that later as well. A second key method issue is that you need to repackage your academic findings in different ways. And I think that Reconnect has done that extremely well. You should all start following after this brief talk Dr. Grogan's Twitter handle, Sticky Tricky Law, which is amazing in explaining the basics of the rule of law. I'll repeat that, Sticky Tricky Law, you should follow that. But I think that some of the members of Reconnect have also been quite successful in using their findings in different ways. For example, through the Good Lobby professors. And in some sort of backhanded way, our influence, I think, was underlined by a troll farm, I think, from the Polish Justice Ministry when they posted a picture of the whole research group with even our name tags on it. So we must have been doing something right. And then I'm come to the very last point. How will I take myself what I learned from Reconnect forward? With my committee, we started a project with Democracy Reporting International, and we created what is called a rule of law, frequently asked questions. And what we did, the basic idea is really flowing from all of these lessons that I have drawn from Reconnect. First, you need to answer questions that politicians and journalists get confronted with all the time. And these questions are actually the result of the smoke screening by the Polish and the Hungarian government. So what we have done is simply developed 25 questions and drafted a very short answer to that. At the moment in French, English, German, Polish, and Hungarian. But they will also show that these answers are non-technical. It's not a legal issue, the rule of law. It's very much a broader issue. And you need to debunk each of these different steps along the way. But I mean, this project would have never seen the light of day without what I've learned from Reconnect. So thanks again for all the amazing work there, and I look forward to the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John. Since as proper academics, you have not complied with your 5-minute limitation, it means that we can only do one round of questions. And I'm going to ask each of you a single question based on the Q&A. So I'm going to start with you, Kim. So we have a question from Natasha. Not an easy question, as always, from Natasha, but a very good one. With successive EU Commission, we see each crisis taking over priority over rule of law concerns in the EU, and that's the question from Natasha. But it is not that with each crisis, we actually accumulating, or rule of law deficiency is growing in a kind of accumulative way. So that's the question for you, Kim. So 2 minutes max.
Yeah, so thank you for that. So yes, this has been sort of the decade of crises in the EU, where every couple of years there's a new crisis, and that new crisis mobilizes resources. It also mobilizes the member states, and it also provides a cover under which member state misbehavior can accelerate. And so, just to take one example from Joel Krogen's field, when the COVID crisis came along, Viktor Orban declared a state of emergency, and literally since the COVID crisis has started, Hungary has been existing under executive decrees that can override any law, including EU law. And who even knows about it, let alone has said it, because a lot of countries had to, sort of modify their usual procedures. And so under cover of one crisis, the rogue states do something else. So I think that, what at least I concluded from looking over the last 10 years is that unless the rule of law is prioritized as kind of the key crisis that these other ones sort of feed into, the European institutions will never come to grips with the fact that this crisis is accelerated, undermined, and aggravated by all of the other crises. So rule of law crisis first is what I would propose we think of from here on out.
Obviously, I could not agree more. Kim, thank you very much. Dan, the next question is for you. It's an easy one. Do you think it is too late? From Jessica, the question is from Jessica, my apologies. And the question is, do you think it's too late to fix the rule of law crisis in Hungary? Or I would say perhaps we can rephrase the question, is it too late to fix the EU's rule of law crisis, not only in Hungary, but looking beyond Hungary?
It's never too late. We must never give up hope. And these autocrats can last a long time, but they can eventually be dislodged. And I guess I would say this. I mean, in Hungary, I think one thing that is too late, it's too late, let's say, to stop Hungary from becoming an autocracy, as some people want, because it's already an autocracy. And I think one of the striking things is that EU leaders very adamantly will refuse, or very carefully refuse, to ever admit that. And I've tried on panels I've been on to get them to recognize reports from Freedom House or VDEM. They'll never admit that there is a non-democratic member state in the EU, because to do so would be to admit, as John Cotter and others talked about, that the EU is operating in violation of Article 10, which requires the Council to be composed of democracies. So they won't. So that's already happened. It's too late to stop that. But no, it's not too late to eventually restore democracy. And I think the last thing I'd say is, I think it's easy for us to think, oh, well, they can wield vetoes. They could veto EU action on Ukraine or other foreign policy matters. And yes, there are problems with the EU's vulnerability to Trojan horses and veto-wielding autocrats. However, let's take a step back. When we talk about the countries that are sliding the fastest into autocracy, these are countries that are completely dependent on the EU for funding and investment. So to kind of claim that the EU is at their mercy I think, has things 100% backwards, right? If there is a political decision to use the power of the EU and its leverage, of course they could help restore democracy. It's just that the politics hasn't been there, and too many leaders have not seen it in their political interest to do anything about the emergence of autocracy.
Thank you very much, Dan. The next question from Blerina is for Dimitri. It's about EU enlargement and the rule of law. And the question, Dimitri, is can we say that EU rule of law conditionality for Western Balkans, but I think we can just make it more general. Does it not work because the rule of law is not properly defined in this enlargement context? So essentially, is the lack of a definition or the lack of a substantive definition, if that is indeed the case, an issue to make rule of law enlargement policy more successful? Dimitri, that's the question for you.
Well, I have written the failure of conditionality 15 years ago, and nothing has changed to my knowledge. It's not because of the definitions that the EU was failing. It's because of the Commission's inept and the Commission's failing approach to the basic assessment of what's going on the ground in those countries. So the failure has not been in pushing some kind of legislative reform. We had this in Hungary, we had this in Poland. The failure has been with generating lasting change. And this was precisely the core goal of all the pre-accession conditionality policy. So as long as that goal has not been achieved, the policy should be scrapped, because now the Union is applying more or less the same in the Western Balkans. Turkey is off the cards. So I have written several papers for Verfassungsblok, for EU Law Live, suggesting that we should deal with Ukrainian application radically differently. We should first admit Ukraine, and then we should establish really long transition periods where Ukraine, together with the EU and together with the experts from all levels who could get involved, ensures that there is lasting transformation. So it's a wake-up call, in fact, what we see in Poland and Hungary in terms of how we should be conducting enlargements. And now a lot of confiscated Russian money that will help to rebuild Ukraine could actually boost the EU's capability in delivering real change that would last.
Thank you very much. Very concise, powerful answer, Dimitri. Thank you very much. Next question from me, Joel, because I couldn't see any question relating to COVID. It must be that because pandemic is over, so they say. So my question to you, based on your research, was there a surprising aspect of the pandemic response based on all of the countries you have reviewed? Any kind of a surprising positive lesson we can draw from your research? Or perhaps not so positive, any surprising aspect?
I was so prepared to answer until you said positive. Two elements I would say is first, our estimation of who was prepared was radically incorrect. The US and the UK ranked globally as most prepared for pandemic, and they were certainly not so. But the second important element, and I would actually pick up on what Kim was talking about earlier in terms of states of emergency, is that what we observed is whether or not a state declared a state of emergency or not, they relied on ordinary law, was not relevant. It was not a predictor as to whether or not there were concerns about the rule of law. We've seen abusive practices in states that avoided states of exception, for example, in Poland, just as we've seen states leaning into autocracy with states of exception and emergency, as in Hungary. So we should always look at the use of law, not simply the form of law. That was surprising to me.
Thank you very much, Joel. Marta, I'm going to abuse the privilege of chairing this discussion to ask you a question. So you have obviously mentioned the shrinking of the civic space. Now, what would you do if you were in charge of the EU Commission? What would be your first step to kind of contain civic space shrinkage? Is there anything the EU could do immediately to help NGOs under siege in a number of member states?
Well, what can the EU do immediately is a big question, but certainly the recommendations should be coming out in this year's report that pertain to civic space, and that should be followed up. Another thing, when it comes to Hungary, which is of course a front runner for bad ideas, but these ideas are being copied, the Commission should very closely monitor how the Lex NGO judgment is being respected. Of course, everybody will remember that this 2017 judgment on foreign funded NGOs was found to be against EU law. And then it took quite a while for the Hungarian government to go through the motions, which otherwise it could do super fast given its parliamentary supermajority, to get rid of that 2017 law and then replace it with another one, which on its surface might look less threatening, but 2022 will be the test of this pudding, and we'll see how the law will be used to perhaps target certain organizations that are, as the new law uses the term, have the potential to influence public life. So that has for me, a reminiscent of the political activities term from Russia. So I would be very carefully watching and not waiting for organizations to actually be harassed and run into problems that will have to be then solved and addressed after they've happened. So I think the Commission in this respect should be very cautious and very, very, on guard. The third thing, of course, is more transparency also from the Commission. So these are we're talking about immediate steps. So the announcement has been made a few weeks ago, 2 weeks ago, about that the funding conditionality regulation has been triggered. I really wonder in what way, on what ground, what are the arguments? It is, I think, in the interest of transparency and also in the interest of organizations that care about rule of law and care about making sure that EU funding goes where it should, that they could contribute to this, but they can only do this if we are aware what the Commission is concerned about. So this letter that hopefully will be sent, has been sent, I don't know when that will happen, will be done soon and will become public. I think there's a lot of interest in this, partly because we want to contribute with information credible from the ground, but also because we've seen how completely baseless accusations have been leveled at the European Commission and even the EU Court of Justice from the Hungarian government. These accusations about how the Brussels is attacking Hungarian traditional family values. These accusations have enormous reach in Hungary. The real truth must be coming out, but it requires actors who have it to dispense it. So I think these are the immediate steps.
Thank you, Marta. And just to clarify, the letter is yet to be sent formally, at least it's my understanding. So the mechanism is yet to be formally activated for the first time. It's expected to be done by the end of this month. John, last but not least, obviously, and I've picked the most difficult question I could find to give you, and you can thank Kolya for that. So that's not entirely my fault. But it's a very good question. In fact, two questions into one, but I'm going to be nice with you. I'm only going to ask you to answer the first one, which is whether one of the main problems in how the EU has dealt or not dealt with democratic backsliding is that the EU is yet to recognize rule of law backsliding as a threat to European democracy. So there is not often this link between judicial independence and actually the well-functioning of any normal democracy. Is that a problem? According to Kolya, it is. What are your views on the link between rule of law backsliding and, in fact, democratic backsliding, and the extent to which the EU has connected the dots here?
Yeah, well, the shortest version of my answer to that question is yes, I agree. My view on the connection is I'll answer that with an anecdote. I wrote an op-ed in a Dutch newspaper which was based on a populism tracker I did for the European Parliament election 2 or 3 years ago, in which I just tried to visualize where in the European political parties the national populist parties were actually part of within the European political parties. And I made the case that if you want to vote in the Netherlands, in fact, your choice is between 5 or 6 different European political parties that each contain bad apples, as I put it. And I got a ring after that op-ed from the headquarters of a mainstream political party in the Netherlands, asking me to please correct the error that I had made, because it couldn't be the case that her political party was in the same political party as the PIS in Poland. So, well, I think that rather than asking me for changing my op-ed, perhaps you can just give a call to your own member of European Parliament and ask her what political group she is in. So to answer that question, it's also very much, this link is very much a link of knowledge or lack of knowledge. A lot of people that vote for European Parliament elections, which are 27 parallel national elections, haven't got the faintest who their own parliamentarians cooperate with. So if you have a rule of law problem in one country, let's say Poland, the democratic connection is not at all made. How this empowers you as a national voter. And I think that there's a huge disconnect that can be and must be bridged. But I hope that gives an answer to the good question. Thanks.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you every one of you. It's been a pleasure listening to you. It's been a pleasure working and discussing rule of law issues. I hope that one day we'll be able to discuss best practices and how they are spreading across jurisdiction rather than the worst practices. Maybe we should just ask Jan to apply for another research project and then work under his great leadership. Petra, it's been a pleasure also co-chairing this panel discussion, and I'm just going to hand over directly to Jan because we are running 5 minutes late. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Laurent and Petra, for so ably chairing this absolutely stunning panel. I'm now quickly looking also whether our next speaker is entering the the audience, because it's now, dear excellencies, colleagues, students, friends of Reconnect, it's my deep honor to announce our last keynote speaker. We have indeed reached the end of a first day of our final Reconnect conference with very rich discussions on the rule of law in Europe. And I really want to thank you all, especially the participants and our presenters, for kicking off our conference with such informative and engaging interventions. But now, to conclude our first day, we are deeply honored to welcome Professor Koen Leenaerts for the final keynote of today. Professor Leenaerts, who I now see appearing on the screen to my great relief. Professor Leenaerts does not need any introduction. You all know he's the president of the Court of Justice of the European Union, professor of European law at KU Leuven. His career is such that we cannot possibly describe it here, but let me just highlight that he has been himself also visiting professor at various prominent institutions, including Harvard Law School, the College of Europe, and that before becoming president of the European Court of Justice, he has been judged at the Court of First Instance, the General Court. Today, since day one, I should really stress, since the court started in 1989, that he has become judge at the Court of Justice in 2003 and has been vice president of the court from 2012 to 2015. And ever since, he is president of the court. If I may add a little personal note, in a way, I think that Koen also has perfectly prepared the way for his unique judicial career with his award-winning doctoral thesis, The Judge and the Constitution. I cannot imagine a better academic preparation for such a unique judicial career. Politico has noted that Koen Leenaerts is the man at the center of every tricky legal issue in the European Union. And today he is here to send us home with a keynote on upholding the rule of law within the EU, staying true to Europe's values. And I'm sure you will all see also today that in everything that Professor Leenaert does, he brings an unrivaled expertise and knowledge, but also what I would call a charismatic enthusiasm, even to quote Lord Gordon Slynn when he wrote his foreword for the very first edition of the great textbook of Koen Leenaerts and Piet van Uffel on EU law. Lord Gordon Slynn gave a great foreword, but he also noted there is a sense of excitement if you read the textbook of Koen. And you always have that sense of excitement. So I'm pretty sure we will have that today as well. Mr. President, dear Koen, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Professor Wouters, dear Jan. It's really a pleasure and an honor for me to speak for the second time in front of such a well-informed and well-committed audience, reconciling Europe with its citizens through democracy and the rule of law, the Reconnect project. And in fact, the reason why I'm so happy to have been invited here is that I think the Court of Justice in its case law does what a court needs to do, and that is decide cases. And it may astonish you that I'm starting with this, but I remember that when the Supreme Court of the United States brought its last visit to the Court of Justice of the European Union, Justice Stephen Breyer said that the job of the court is to decide cases. And then we thought, yes, but that's rather obvious, is it not? He said, yes, but it's important because a court is a reactive institution. The political institutions are proactive institutions. And often too much is being expected from a court. I say this because I listened very carefully the whole afternoon, and I'm very happy that I was able to join in and to listen to all these expert contributions. A court must decide the cases as they are submitted, taking into account the limits to its jurisdiction. I heard one speaker say that the court was maybe a little bit reluctant in preliminary references, sometimes calling a reference to be inadmissible. And my answer is, yes, that is true, because the Court of Justice itself is bound by the rule of law, meaning that the court is subject to the principle of conferral. It has only the jurisdiction which has been conferred on the court. I also heard one speaker making comparisons between what happens in some member states and what happens at the level of the union itself. But the learned speaker has maybe lost sight of the fact that the member states are states. They are sovereign states. The European Union is an international organization, and I'm not hesitant about using that terminology. It's an international organization of a very specific kind, surely, but it is an international organization whose existence is dependent on the decisions of sovereign states to join that organization. That is our Whiteman judgment of the 10th of December 2018. It's a democratically legitimated sovereign decision of each one of the member states and their peoples in accordance with their own constitutional traditions to join or to leave the European Union. The Union as a whole has conferred competence and operates in accordance with its constitutional charter, being the treaties, the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So that is the context within which we operate. And therefore, the contribution which the Court of Justice makes to the rule of law and democracy debate is confined to deciding cases relating to the operationalization of these values. And they're, roughly speaking, two types of proceedings. There are, as Judge Rosa said this afternoon, there are the infringement proceedings. Those are, procedurally speaking, the easiest ones in terms of jurisdiction of the court, because in an infringement proceeding, the court can judge the facts, the national legal texts, the national practice. The court can really rule on infringement or no infringement and assess union law, national law, the facts, the practices, everything as a whole. It's really there a court with plenary jurisdiction to assess what is submitted to the court. That is very different in a reference for a preliminary ruling. In a reference for a preliminary ruling, the ruling of the court must be necessary, as the treaty uses the word, necessary in Article 267, to decide the case pending in the national court, the so-called main action. And when that necessity is not sufficiently demonstrated, the court must decline jurisdiction. What happened in the Miasto-Wovic case in 2020, and which happened again in the recent Getin-Nobel case. So those are cases where the referring courts, in spite of the very importance of the substance of the case, had not sufficiently demonstrated the need to obtain a preliminary decision, preliminary ruling of our court in order to allow the referring court to decide the main action. However, going back to Miasto-Wovic, the 2020 case, there you see that in parallel, the Commission had brought a case against Poland on the disciplinary regime for judges. And in that direct action, which led to the landmark judgment of the 15th of July of last year, the court could go into all the details required, a little bit like the Human Rights Court could do it, in depth, and decided what was wrong with the disciplinary proceedings against judges in that state. So it is not because the court declines jurisdiction in a preliminary reference that the matter does not come to the court, but it then comes through the other procedure. But of course, it presupposes that the Commission or another member state launches such an action. But of course, again, the judge is reactive. We cannot trigger cases. We can only decide cases which have been submitted to us within the confines of our jurisdiction. And a second remark of procedure before I enter into some considerations on the substance, that is that when the preliminary references are admissible, because indeed there is a link on substance or on procedural matter or on the jurisdiction of the referring court or whatever it be, a sufficient link that a necessity is established. What can we then do? Then we must interpret union law, because the application of union law is a matter for the referring courts and for other national courts applying our ruling. Now, the difficulty there is when you remain at a relatively abstract general level of interpretation of union law requirements, you're not very useful. So we must be sufficiently concrete and precise in the interpretation that it be a useful interpretation for the referring court. On the other hand, we cannot directly qualify national law in view of the union law which we interpret, because that would go beyond the jurisdiction of the preliminary reference procedure. So we go as far as we can to make ourselves well understood, but it remains a limit on our jurisdiction. And that is why the preliminary references are often thereafter sort of manipulated in terms of media comments of what we actually decided, and some pretend the message not to be clear, although the message is absolutely clear, but I mean, it will never be an operative part of the judgment which directly finds a breach or not. So with these procedural remarks in the background, just a number of points on substance. I think we should absolutely analyze, and it might be a subject also for a research group like this one to do it, the judgment of the 16th of February of this year, 2022, on the conditionality regime for the Next Generation EU funds and other structural funds handed out by the Union to member states. This conditionality regime judgment, it should really be analyzed painstakingly, paragraph per paragraph, because, of course, since this is an action for annulment brought by Hungary and Poland against the European Parliament and the Council, supported by 10 other member states, the sort of temptation might be to say, well, the court dismissed the action, final stop, the program can get through. Yes, that is of course true, but the reasoning is extremely important. This is an action for annulment, so the court had to, in order to reject the action, the court had to meet all the arguments which have been raised by Hungary and by Poland. And those considerations, dismissing the arguments of the applicants, they show what the European Union as an entity stands for. First of all, the court, in the purest style of Ronald Dworkin, has explained the sort of dégradé from values over principles to rules. We should not forget that the regulation of December 2020 of the European Parliament and the Council defines a whole list of principles. And that is for the first time that at legislative level, the value of the rule of law is now being declined in a whole range of principles. And those principles are further elaborated in the rules, putting into effect that mechanism on conditionality. So you have value of rule of law, principles, and rules. At the level of the values, the court had to refute the argument made by Poland and by Hungary that the value of the rule of law is way too abstract. It's maybe some ideal to be reached. It's a political value. It is something too general to be legally enforceable. That was the argument made. And the court says, no, this value, as it has been concretized in principles and rules adopted within the confines of the conferred jurisdiction to the European Union, the value becomes the bearer of binding obligations, which can be enforced by a court. So there are several elements here. The court links the value to its operationalization through principles and rules which have been adopted by the legislator of the Union, acting within the confines, within the limits of the principle of conferral. And what was here the competential basis? It is Article 322 of the TFEU, financial regulations, and we said, yes, financial regulations can entail the competence to protect the union budget or the financial interests of the union, also from a rule of law perspective. And we quoted there, see in our case law, all the cases refer to each other. We said, well, last year, 2021, we handed down 2 landmark grand chamber cases concerning Romania. One of the 18th of May, 2021, the other one of 21st of December, 2021, the Eurobox case. In those cases, it is made clear that aspects of judicial reform in Romania had the effect of blocking the fight against corruption with union funds for over 300 million euros. Cases which had been, in the facts of those two judgments, you will read the judgment, you will see it, they had in fact blocked the procedures in a way that time would run out, that cases had to be restarted. So a whole range of obstacles had been put to the pending procedures, so that de facto procurators were put under pressure not to pursue some of the cases, to pursue other cases, etc., to give other priorities. So the link between the protection of the union budget and the financial interests of the union is of course established through these cases, which we quote in our judgment of the 16th of February of this year. Now, I know that sometimes researchers, legal and non-legal researchers, they have the impression, but what the fuss, the rule of law is a sufficiently important value, we should be able to protect it even independently from the financial interests of the European Union. Well, here again, the European Union is not a state. The court said it expressly in opinion 2/13 on the accession of the EU to the ECHR. And one has to take into account that specificity of the European Union as a limited jurisdiction entity whose competences derive from what the member states have conferred to it. So that is why in that judgment of the 16th of February, we say, yes, the Union can take all the legislation to protect the values of Article 2, but it can only do so to the extent that another provision of the treaties of primary law of the Union confers the competence to do so. In this case, the Parliament and the Council, on a proposal from the European Commission, have taken Article 322 of the TFEU to be the basis for that competence conferral, and hence it is the financial regulations competence to protect the sound budget of the Union, the financial interests of the Union. So that is the link we make there. However, the reasoning goes then on and says, yes, but is this not in fact a circumvention of Article 7? And we say, no, Article 7 is a totally different kind of procedure. Article 7 is a political mechanism which is meant to become operational in matters not covered by substantive union law. Just across the board, the fact that member states need to comply with the requirements of the rule of law, of democracy, of fundamental rights in all subject matters, also those not covered by substantive union law. The substantive union law limitation is known in Article 51(1) of the Charter. That is only when member states are implementing union law, they should respect fundamental rights. In the rule of law mechanism, it is different. The rule of law mechanism, there the link must be with the financial interests of the Union, as I already said. And we went on saying the values of Article 2, they should be considered together. So it is human dignity, freedom, democracy, respect for the rule of law, fundamental rights, in a society characterized by pluralism, tolerance, equality, including the protection of minorities, and solidarity. And here you have it, solidarity. So we say all these values are linked to one another. You can't have respect for the rule of law when there is no democracy. You could even say liberal democracy, because you should read freedom and democracy together. You need this liberal democracy to have the rule of law. Why? It's only a liberal democracy which knows separation of powers, where the judiciary can uphold the fundamental rights of the minority, such as sexual minorities, for instance, to take an example which was quoted this afternoon, against the legislation of the majority. So it's a protection of the minority in its fundamental rights. It's basically what Alexander Hamilton has already written in the Federalist Papers in the United States, namely that the minority needs to be protected against the tyranny of the majority, making also political alternance possible. So that is why pluralism, tolerance, solidarity is linked to liberal democracy protected by a written constitution, a Bill of Rights, Marbury versus Madison, that's the position of the Court of Justice, controlling compliance by the member states and by the Union institutions with the basic constitutional charter, the treaties. Paragraph 23 of Lever against European Parliament. So it comes all together in that judgment of the 16th of February of this year. Now, we say that respect for democracy, the rule of law, and fundamental rights is a precondition for solidarity to operate in the European Union governance system. When financial solidarity comes into play, it means that the Union hands out money to those member states in need of receiving it. We all know, that's a proper feature of solidarity, that money flows from richer to poorer, which is normal. But all of the member states must have the guarantee that those receiving the funds will use the funds in compliance with the values I just quoted. And so that is why we say in the judgment of the 16th of February that solidarity is resting on mutual trust between the member states that the monies be used in compliance with liberal democracy, rule of law, fundamental rights, in a spirit of equality, including protection of minorities, etc. And that must be able to be controlled by the Commission when it puts into effect the conditionality mechanism. Of course, the Commission must always make the link, the judgment says a direct link, between the rule of law infringement, that is one principle out of the list of the regulation, as I already said, and you will see when you read that list that there is a flow over with these other values. It's not the rule of law in isolation, it's called the rule of law mechanism, but in fact it hinges on equality, for instance, which is the whole non-discrimination legislation of the European Union, operationalizes the value of equality. Well, equality and equal treatment before the law is one of the principles of the rule of law mechanism. So you see the flow over between all of these values. So in the judgment, we say the mechanism of conditionality is a precondition for mutual trust to exist between the member states, itself a precondition for solidarity, in this case financial solidarity between the member states to become operational. Now, Poland and Hungary also said, well, we have our own understanding of the rule of law and of democracy. For us, it's maybe an illiberal kind of democracy. It's another type of democracy, and that's national identity. There, the judgment, and it's absolutely new, for the first time, says no. A member state has its identity. That's quite clear. For France, for instance, it might be the principle of laïcité. For another member state, it might be the protection of the national language. Think already of the Groener case of 1989 in Ireland for the Gaelic language. And there are other examples. Austria in the form of a republic, Saint Wittgenstein. So there are cases where the national identity must be accommodated by union law, fair enough. The treaty provides for this, it's Article 4, paragraph 2. However, we say expressly, national identity can never, never, never be invoked against the values of Article 2 as interpreted by the Court of Justice in a uniform manner for all the member states. Because there it is the identity of the union. So we, for the first time, use the term, the identity of the union is based on the values of Article 2, operationalized in primary law, in secondary law, whenever that secondary law can rest on a competence basis in the treaties, such as here the conditionality mechanism for the Next Generation EU funds. And so the union identity can never be contradicted by the national identity when it hinges on these values. So that is also a core element of that judgment of the 16th of February full court judgment of this year. So it means that member states, when acceding to the European Union, they know that they enter a structure which presupposes that they themselves are a liberal democracy based on pluralism, on tolerance, on constitutional protection of minorities, political minorities, trade union minorities, sexual minorities, whatever minorities. So it is the protection in the purest Hamiltonian sense of the minority against tyranny of the majority. And whenever there is a link to a competence basis for the union to act at legislative level, these values can be further elaborated in principles and in rules. Whenever there is no such competence basis, there is only Article 7 of the TEU left, that is the political mechanism. Now, the Commission has launched a whole range of infringement actions. It has always done so by combining Article 2 of the TEU with other articles of the TEU or the TFEU, or sometimes a charter, in a case of substantive union law. For instance, the early retirement age for judges, which was different for women and for men judges. It's many years ago now. It's a clear example. Of course, everyone knows that the real problem behind is a problem of judicial independence, judicial impartiality. But the Commission must always find the substantive link. We made, as you all know, a major advance in our case law in the so-called Portuguese judges' judgment. The Portuguese judges' judgment was in fact an outflow of the Eurozone crisis, where Portugal had to save on public salaries and pensions, and they decided horizontally for the highest salaries and pensions to temporarily reduce them by between 5 and 15%, depending on the height of the salary of the pension. So also judges were concerned. And as you know, some of these judges had a very bad idea to say, well, that is against our independence. And our court had no difficulty, seized by preliminary reference from the Supreme Administrative Court in Portugal, our court had no difficulty saying, well, this is no problem of judicial independence. The judges have not been specifically targeted. This is a horizontal measure, so there is no problem of judicial independence. In a way, that is the uninteresting part of the judgment. Of course, it was the only part in which these judges were interested, the applicants in the main action. But in terms of constitutional law, the 80% of the text of the judgment which comes before that factual finding is important. It is there that the Court of Justice made clear that national judges who are in a position to interpret and apply and enforce union law, they are functionally speaking union judges. Different from the United States, where you have a separation of federal courts and state courts, here the two are merged. The union courts are not the two courts sitting in Luxembourg. The main union courts are the national courts applying union law and national law in an integrated manner as part of a single legal system, the domestic legal system of each member state, where union law has to be integrated with its primacy of application, its direct effect, etc. We all know these rules. Now, in order to make sure that all the member state courts are equally equipped and capable of enforcing union law, this is ultimately a matter of equality of member states and their citizens before union law. All these national courts must be able to operate in a regime of separation of powers, independent courts, courts in the Hamiltonian sense. Marbury versus Madison, yes, this is counter-majoritarian if you want. It may well be that on the basis of the primacy of union law, they have to leave out of application, to set aside the application of a national law because it's in conflict with a rule of union law. But if the rule of union law is a valid rule of union law, and the Court of Justice may clarify this after a reference for a preliminary ruling, the national courts must comply, because otherwise union law is no longer the same everywhere in the union, and the union legal system falls apart. So the independence and impartiality of national courts is for the Court of Justice first and foremost a precondition for the respect of the structural principles governing the relationship between union law and national law. And that is the way this Portuguese judge's case or judgment has reasoned why we are competent to answer preliminary questions when the independence or impartiality of national courts is being threatened. And those are courts potentially dealing with union law matters. And it's only after the Portuguese judge's judgment that the European Commission said, aha, that's the way to do it. So the first action for infringement against Poland relating to an aspect of the independence of the judiciary came 2 months after the Portuguese judgment case, which was heavily quoted and elaborated. So you see, the court is always reactive. The court tries to stay within the confines of its own jurisdiction, to consolidate the identity of the union based on Article 2. It made clear in the Republica case, the Maltese case, that full compliance with all the values of Article 2 is a precondition for the full enjoyment of the rights flowing from union law. That is being conferred and elaborated in the conditionality full court judgment of 16th of February. And last, it has been stressed that in no case there can be any backsliding, that is going backwards. So that was relevant in the Republica case because Poland intervened in that case and they said, yes, but what they're doing in Malta is not so different from what we are doing in Poland. And we said, yes, but there is a very important difference. That is that in Poland you had a state of legislation and it was amended to the effect that the independence and impartiality of the judiciary became weaker. Whereas in Malta, there was initially a full political discretion in the appointment of judges, and they had newly inserted an advisory body, which then made it extremely hard, very high degree, a threshold of obstacle for the prime minister, not the minister of justice, the prime minister of Malta, to make the appointment. So you see, all of this is relevant, and the court comes to a rich part of judgments, a rich arsenal better of judgments. Now, to conclude, I think that the Court of Justice has now come relatively close to have said, after all these infringement proceedings and references for preliminary ruling, what you can possibly say without repeating yourself, so to speak. All of these shows Nowhere in the world the judiciary can enforce its own judgments. Justice Breyer, already referred to, said in that same speech to the personnel of our court that the Supreme Court of the United States cannot enforce its own judgments. It must be done by the executive if need be. And we all know the historical example after Brown versus Board of Education, 1954. Even the National Guard was sent to the southern states. Fortunately enough, the European Union has no National Guard. But mutatis mutandis, it is after our judgments the responsibility of the European Commission, but also, and one speaker said it, of the member states. The member states should be far more severe with one another. The member states can do that. The member states can activate the first stage of Article 70 EU, where the majority requirement is not unanimity. The member states can, even without activating a procedure, the member states can, in the General Affairs Council, really ask accounting from the member state concerned how they implement the rulings of the Court of Justice. This can be done. It is, again, to quote Alexander Hamilton, who said that the judiciary is the least dangerous branch. It has not the power of the sword, nor the power of the purse. It has only the power of persuasion. That is the strength of the legal reasoning. That is what the Court of Justice tries to set out, strongly reasoned judgments in relation to the member states, in relation to the union itself, but taking into account the fact that the union is not a state, but an international organization. But we do it since Lever judgment. And that does not mean that you will agree with each one of our judgments, but the even-handedness as to the union and the member states is clearly there. Whatever some academics might superficially have said on the basis of one or another recent case. When you reason painstakingly paragraph per paragraph of all the decisions, you can see that there is the same standards which apply everywhere. But once that has been done, it is of course up to the Commission and to the member states to take their responsibility, and they will only do it when they are pressurized by citizens, by academics. Hence the big importance of projects like Reconnect. I really believe in them. It is important that you do the part which intelligentsia should do in order to pressurize the political authorities to implement the judgments of the court. The judgments will be there, even if they're not immediately complied with. One speaker said we will not have the same regime, I think it was Professor Kellerman, we will not have the same regime always. The judgments are there. Brown v. Board of Education has not been implemented very rapidly either, but it still holds true as one of the landmark judgments of the US Supreme Court's case law. We are in the same position. It's a constitutional court of a non-state actor, of a composite legal order, where all the member states, if they want to be part of that composite legal order, and that is their own sovereign decision, then they should comply with the identity of the union. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. President Dear Koen, for this immensely rich and brilliant presentation. I think you definitely persuaded us that the power of persuasion is not only with the court, but also with the president of the court. Thank you so much for sharing your very deep insights and bringing us basically back to the fundamentals that you have detailed to us in a very didactical way, showing us in a certain way also, again, the continuity between the insights that you already developed in your thesis with the comparison with the United States, the Court of Justice and the European Court of Human Rights, to from the Federalist Papers, so to say, to the most recent landmark judgments of the European Court of Justice. There is a remarkable consistency in all of this, and we're very grateful, not just for sharing this with us, but also for giving us as a Reconnect Consortium also a research agenda for the next coming years. Thank you for that as well.
Thank you.
My dear conference participants, dear speakers, dear audience, it's been a great pleasure to be with us today. We really are grateful for your attendance, for your active participation. I would like to ask you, do join us tomorrow for the second online conference about democracy. And those who can, you are still very welcome to join us physically in Brussels on Thursday afternoon at the Fondation Universitaire. You can still register. It will be great fun to see each other back, not just on a screen, but also live. So thank you very much and wish you all a great evening. Bye.